Chapter 13 of 12 Years a Slave by Solomon Northup.
This is a LibriVox recording.
All
is in the public
recordings
domain.
are in the public domain.
On my
For more
arrival at
information
Master
or to
Epps,
volunteer,
in
please
obedience
visit
to his order,
LibriVox.org.
the first business upon which I
12
entered was
Years
the
a
making
Slave
of an
by
axe
Solomon
helve.
Northup.
The handles
Chapter
in
1.
use there are simply a round,
Having been
straight
born a
stick.
freeman,
I
and for
made
more
a
than
crooked
30
one,
years
shaped
enjoyed
like
the
those
blessings
to
of
which I had
liberty
been
in a free
accustomed
state,
at the North.
and having at the end
When
of that
finished
time
and
been
presented
kidnapped
to
and
Epps,
sold into
he
slavery,
looked at it with
where I
astonishment,
remained
unable
until
to
happily
determine
rescued in
exactly
the
what
month
it
of
was.
January
He
1853
had never before
after a
seen such
bondage
a
of
handle,
12 years.
and when
It
I
has been
explained its
suggested that an
conveniences,
account of
he
my
was
life and
forcibly
fortunes
struck with
would
the
not be
novelty of the
uninteresting
idea.
to the public.
He kept it in the house
Since
a
my
long
return
time,
to liberty,
and when his
I have
friends
not failed
called,
to
was
perceive the
wont to
increasing
exhibit it
interest
as a
throughout the
curiosity.
northern states in
It was now
regard to
the
the
season
subject
of
of
hoeing.
slavery.
I was
Works of
first
fiction
sent into the
professing to
cornfield,
portray
and
its features
afterwards
in their
set
more
to
pleasing
scraping
as well as
cotton.
more repugnant
In
aspects
this
have been
employment I remained
circulated to
until
an
hoeing
extent
time was nearly
unprecedented,
past,
and,
when
as
I began
understand,
to
have
experience the
created a
symptoms
fruitful
of
topic
approaching
of comment
illness.
and discussion.
I was
I
attacked
can
with
speak of
chills,
slavery
which were
only so far
succeeded
as it
by a
came under
burning
my
fever.
own observation,
I became
only
weak
so
and
far as I
emaciated,
have known
and
and
frequently
experienced it
so
in my
dizzy
own
that it
person.
caused me to
My
reel and
object
stagger
is
like a
to give a
drunken man.
candid and truthful statement
Nevertheless,
of facts,
I was
to
compelled to
repeat
keep
the
up
story
my
of my
row.
life
When
without
in health, I
exaggeration,
found little
leaving it for
difficulty in
others to
keeping
determine
pace with my
whether
fellow
even the
labourers.
pages of
But
fiction
now
present
it
a
seemed
picture
an utter
of more
impossibility.
cruel wrong or
Often
a
I
severer
fell
bondage.
behind, when the
As
driver's
far
lash
back as
was
I have
sure
been
to
able
greet
to
my back,
ascertain, my
infusing
ancestors
into
on the
my sick
paternal
and
side were
drooping body
slaves in
a
Rhode
little
Island.
temporary energy.
They belonged to a
I
family by
continued
the
to
name of
decline
Northup,
until at length
one of
the
whom,
whip became
removing to the
entirely
states of New
ineffectual.
York,
The
settled at
sharpest
Hoosier
sting of the
in
rawhide
Rensselaer
could not
County.
arouse me.
He brought with him
Finally, in
Mintus
September,
Northup, my
when
father.
the busy season
On
of
the death
cotton
of this
picking was at
gentleman,
hand,
which
I
must
was
have occurred
unable
some
to
50
leave my
years
cabin.
ago, my father
Up to this
became
time,
free,
I had
having
received
been
no medicine,
emancipated by a
nor any
direction in his
attention
will.
from my master or
Henry
mistress.
B. Northup, Esquire,
The old
of Sandy
cook
Hill,
visited me
a
occasionally,
distinguished counsellor
preparing
at
me
law,
corn coffee,
and the man to
and
whom,
sometimes
under
boiling a bit
Providence,
of bacon,
I am indebted
when
for my
I had
present
grown
liberty,
too feeble to
and my
accomplish
return
it
to the
myself.
society of my wife and
When
children
it was said
is
that
a
I would
relative
die,
of the family in
Master
which my
Epps,
forefathers
unwilling
were
to
thus
bear the
held to
loss
service,
which the death
and
of
from
an
which they
animal
took
worth
the name I bear.
$1,000 would bring
To
upon
this
him,
fact may be
concluded
attributed
to
the
incur the
persevering
expense of
interest he has
sending to
taken in my
Holmesville for
behalf.
Dr. Wines.
Sometime after
He
my
announced
father's
to Epps
liberation,
that it was
he
the
removed
effect of
to
the
the town
climate,
of Minerva,
and there was a
Essex
probability
County, New
of his
York,
losing
where
me.
I was born in the
He
month of
directed me
July
to eat no
1808.
meat, and to
How long
partake
he
of no
remained
more
in the
food
latter
than was
place, I have
absolutely
not the
necessary
means of
to
definitely
sustain life.
ascertaining. From thence
Several
he
weeks
removed to
elapsed,
Granville,
during
Washington
which time,
County,
under the
near a
scanty
place known
diet
as
to which I
Sliborough,
was subjected,
where for
I
some
had
years
partially
he laboured
recovered.
on the farm of Clark
One
Northup,
morning,
also
long
a
before
relative
I was in
of
a
his
proper
old master.
condition to labour,
From thence
Epps
he
appeared at
removed
the
to the
cabin
Olden
door,
farm at
and,
Moss Street,
presenting me a
short
sack,
distance
ordered
north
me
of the
to the
village
cotton
of Sandy
field.
Hill, and from
At
thence
this
to the
time,
farm
I had
now
had no
owned
experience
by Russell
whatever
Pratt,
in cotton picking.
situated on the road
It was an
leading
awkward
from Fort
business
Edward
indeed.
to Argyll,
While
where he
others
continued
used
to
both
reside
hands,
until his death,
snatching the
which
cotton
took
and
place on the
depositing it in the
22nd
mouth
day
of
of
the sack
November,
with a precision and
1829.
dexterity that
He
was
left a widow and
incomprehensible
2
to me.
children,
I
myself
had to seize
and
the
Joseph,
ball with
an
one
elder
hand,
brother.
and
The
deliberately
latter is
draw
still
out the
living in the
white
county
gushing
of
blossom
Oswego,
with the
near
other.
the city of that name.
Depositing the
My
cotton
mother
in the
died
sack,
during the
moreover,
period of
was
my
a difficulty
captivity.
that demanded the
Though
exercise
born
of
a
both
slave
hands
and
and eyes.
labouring under the
I was
disadvantages
compelled
to
to
which
pick it
my
from the ground
unfortunate
where it would
race
fall,
is subjected,
nearly as often
my
as
father
from the
was a man
stalk where it had
respected
grown.
for his industry and
I
integrity,
made havoc also
as many
with
now
the
living
branches,
who well
loaded
remember
with the
him
yet
are ready to
unbroken
testify.
bowls, the long,
His whole life
cumbersome
was
sack
passed in the
swinging
peaceful
from
pursuits
side
of
to side
agriculture,
in a manner
never
not
seeking
allowable in
employment
the
in
cotton
those more
field.
menial positions
After a
which
most
seem to be
laborious day,
especially
I
allotted to the
arrived at the
children
gin
of
house
Africa.
with my load.
Besides giving
When
us
the
an
scale
education
determined its
surpassing
weight
that
to be
ordinarily
only
bestowed upon children
£95,
in our
not
condition,
half the
he
quantity
acquired by his
required of the
diligence and
poorest
economy
picker,
a sufficient
Epps threatened
property
the
qualification
severest flogging.
to entitle him to
But
the right
in
of suffrage.
consideration of my
He
being
was
a
accustomed
raw
to speak
hand,
to us of his early
concluded
life,
to pardon me
and
on
although
that
at all
occasion.
times
The
cherishing the
following
warmest
day,
emotions actions of
many
kindness,
days succeeding,
and even of
I
affection
returned at
towards
night
the
with
family
no better
in whose
success.
house he had been a
I was
bondsman.
evidently not
He
designed
nevertheless
for that kind
comprehended
of
the
labour.
system of
I
slavery,
had not the gift,
and dwelt with
the
sorrow
dexterous
on the
fingers and
degradation
quick
of his
motion
race.
of Patsy,
He endeavoured
who
to
could fly
imbue our
along
minds
one
with
side of a
sentiments
row
of
of
morality,
cotton, stripping
and to
it
teach
of its
us to place our
undefiled and
trust and
fleecy
confidence in
weakness
in him who
miraculously
regards the
fast.
humblest as well as
Practice
the
and
highest of
whipping
his
were
creatures.
alike unavailing,
How often
and
since that
Epps,
time has the
satisfied of it at
recollection
last,
of his paternal
swore I was a
counsels occurred
disgrace,
to me,
that I
while
was not
lying in a
fit to
slave hut in
associate
the
with a
distant and
cotton-picking
sickly regions
nigger,
of Louisiana,
that I did not pick
smarting
enough
with the
in a day to
undeserved
pay the
wounds
trouble of
which an
weighing it,
inhuman master
and
had
that I should
inflicted,
go into the
and
cotton
longing
field
only
no
for the
more.
grave which had covered
I was
him
now
to
employed in
shield me
cutting
also
and hauling
from
wood,
the lash of the
drawing
oppressor.
cotton from the field
In
to
the
the gin house,
churchyard at Sandy
and
Hill,
performed
an
whatever
humble
other
stone
service
marks
was
the
required.
spot where he reposes,
Suffice to say,
after having
I was
worthily
never permitted
performed
to
the
be idle.
duties appertaining to the
It was
lowly
rarely
sphere
that a day
wherein
passed
God
by
had appointed
without
him
one
to
or
walk.
more whippings.
Up to this
This occurred
period,
at
I
the
had
time
been
the
principally
cotton was
engaged
weighed.
with my father
The
in the labours
delinquent
of the
whose
farm.
weight had fallen
The
short
leisure hours
was
allowed me
taken
were
out,
generally either
stripped,
employed over
made
my
to
books,
lie upon the
or
ground,
playing on the
face
violin,
downwards,
an
when he
amusement which
received
was the
a
ruling
punishment
passion of my
proportioned
youth.
to his offence.
It has also been the source of
It is the
consolation
literal,
since,
unvarnished
affording
truth
pleasure
that
to
the
the
crack
simple
of the
beings
lash
with whom
and
my
the
lot was
shrieking of the
cast,
slaves
and
can
beguiling
be
my
heard
own
from
thoughts
dark
for
till
many
bedtime
hours
on
from the
Epps
painful
plantation,
contemplation
any
of
day
my
almost
fate.
during the entire
On
period
Christmas
of the
Day,
cotton-picking season.
1829, I was
The
married to
number of
Anne
lashes
Hampton,
is
a
graduated
coloured girl
according to the
then
nature
living
of
in
the
the
case.
vicinity of our residence.
25
The
are
ceremony
deemed a
was
mere
performed
brush,
at Fort
inflicted,
Edward
for
by
instance,
Timothy
when a
Eddy
dry
Esquire,
leaf or
a
piece of
magistrate
ball
of that
is
town,
found in
and
the
still
cotton,
a prominent
or
citizen
when a
of the
branch is
place.
broken in the field.
She had resided a long
50
time at
is the
Sandy
ordinary
Hill with
penalty
Mr.
following
Baird,
all delinquencies
proprietor
of
of
the
the
next
Eagle
higher
Tavern,
grade.
and also in the family
100
of
is
Reverend
called
Alexander
severe.
Proudfit
It is the
of Salem.
punishment inflicted
This
for the
gentleman
serious
for many
offence of
years had
standing idle in
presided
the
over the
field.
Presbyterian
From
Society at the
150
latter
to
place,
200
and was
is
widely
bestowed upon
distinguished for
him
his
who
learning and
quarrels with his
piety.
cabin mates,
Anne
and
still holds
500,
in grateful
well laid
remembrance
on,
the
besides the
exceeding
mangling
kindness
of the
and
dogs,
the
perhaps,
excellent
is
counsels
certain
of
to
that good
consign the
man.
poor
She
unpitied
is not
runaway
able to
weeks
determine
of
the
pain
exact
and
line
agony.
of her descent, but the
During
blood
the
of
2
three
years
races
Epps
mingles in
remained
her
on the
veins.
plantation at
It is
Bayou Huff
difficult to
Power,
tell
he was
whether
in the
the
habit,
red,
as
white, or
often as
black
once in a
predominates.
fortnight at least,
The union
of
of them
coming
all,
home
however, in
intoxicated
her
from
origin, has
Holmesville.
given her a singular but
The
pleasing
shooting matches
expression,
almost
such as is
invariably
rarely to be
concluded
seen.
with a
Though
debauch.
somewhat resembling,
At such
yet she
times he
cannot
was
properly be
boisterous and
styled a
half
quadroon,
crazy.
a class to
Often
which
he would
I
break
have
the
omitted to
dishes,
mention
chairs,
my mother
and
belonged.
whatever furniture he
I
could
had
lay
just
his
now
hands on.
passed the period of
When
my
satisfied
minority,
with his
having reached
amusement
the
in the
age of
house,
21
he would
years in the
seize the
month of
whip
July
and walk
previous.
forth into the yard.
Deprived of the advice
Then
and
it
assistance of
behooved
my
the
father,
slaves to be
with a
watchful
wife
and
dependent
exceeding
upon me
wary.
for support,
The first
I
one who
resolved
came
to
within
enter
reach
upon a
felt
life
the
of
smart
industry,
of his lash.
and notwithstanding the
Sometimes
obstacle
for
of colour
hours he would
and the
keep them running
consciousness
in
of
all
my lowly
directions,
state,
dodging around
indulged
the
in
corners
pleasant
of the
dreams
cabins.
of a good time
Occasionally
coming, when
he
the
would come
possession
upon
of some
one
humble
unawares,
habitation,
and if
with
he
a few
succeeded in
surrounding
inflicting a
acres,
fair
should
round
reward my
blow,
labours
it was a
and
feat
bring me
that
the
much
means of
delighted him.
happiness and comfort.
The younger
From
children
the time of
and
my
the
marriage
aged
to
who
this
had
day,
become
the
inactive
love I have
suffered
borne my
then.
wife has been
In the midst
sincere
of the
and
confusion,
unabated,
he would
and
slyly
only
take
those
his
who have
stand
felt the
behind a
glowing
cabin,
tenderness a
waiting
father
with
cherishes
raised
for
whip
his
to
offspring
dash
can
it into the
appreciate my
first black
affection
face
for the
that
beloved
peeped
children
cautiously
which have
around
since
the
been
corner.
born to us.
At
This
other
much I
times he
deem
would come home
appropriate
in
and
a less
necessary
brutal
to say,
humour.
in order
Then
that
there
those
must be
who
a
read these
merry-making.
pages may
Then all
comprehend
must
the
move to the
poignancy
measure
of
of a
those
tune.
sufferings I have
Then
been
Master
doomed to
Epps
bear.
must needs regale his
Immediately upon
melodious
our
ears
marriage,
with
we
the music
commenced
of a fiddle.
housekeeping in
Then
the
did
old
he
yellow
become
building
buoyant,
then standing
elastic,
at the southern
gaily
extremity
tripping
of
the
Fort
light
Edward
fantastic
village,
toe
and which has
around
since
the
been
piazza
transformed
and
into a
all
modern
through the
mansion,
house.
and lately occupied
Tibeats,
by
at the
Captain
time of
Lathrop.
my sale,
It is
had
known as the
informed him
Fort
I could
House.
play on the
In this
violin.
building,
He
the
had
courts were
received this
sometime
information
held
from
after the
Ford.
organisation of the
Through
county.
the
It was
importunities
also
of Mistress
occupied
Epps,
by
her
Burgoyne in
husband had been induced to
1777,
purchase
being
me one
situated
during
near
a
the
visit
old
to New
fort
Orleans.
on the left bank of the
Frequently
Hudson.
I was
During
called
the
into
winter,
the house
I
to
was
play
employed
before
with
the
others
family,
repairing
Mistress
the Champlain
being
Canal,
passionately
and
fond
that
of
section
music.
over which William Van
All of us
Nortwick
would be
was
assembled in the
superintendent.
large room
David
of the great
McEachran
house
had the immediate
whenever
charge
Epps
of the
came
men in
home in
whose
one of his
company I laboured.
moods.
By the time the
No
canal
matter how
opened in the
worn out
spring,
and tired
I was
we were,
enabled,
there
from the
must be a
savings of my
general dance.
wages, to purchase
When
a pair
properly
of horses
stationed on the floor,
and other things
I would strike
necessarily
up a tune.
required in the business of
Dance, you
navigation.
damned niggers,
Having hired
dance,
several
Epps would
efficient
shout.
hands to assist me,
Then there
I
must be
entered
no
into
halting
contracts
or
for the
delay,
transportation
no
of
slow
large
or
rafts of
languid
timber
movements.
from Lake
All
Champlain
must
to
be
Troy.
brisk and lively
Dyer
and
Beckwith
alert.
and a Mr.
Up
Bartlemy
and
of
down,
Whitehall
heel and toe,
accompanied
and
me on
away we
several
go,
trips.
was the order
During
of
the
the hour.
season, I became perfectly
Epps' portly
familiar with the
form
art and
mingled with
mysteries
those
of
of his
rafting,
dusky
a
slaves,
knowledge which
moving
afterwards
rapidly
enabled me
through
to
all
render
the mazes
profitable
of the
service
dance.
to a worthy master,
Usually his
and
whip
to
was in
astonish
his
the
hand,
simple-witted
ready
lumbermen
to fall
on the
about the
banks of the
ears of the
Bayou Burr.
presumptuous thrall,
In one of my
who
voyages
dared to
down
rest a
Lake
moment,
Champlain,
or
I was
even
induced
stop
to
to
make a
catch his
visit to
breath.
Canada.
When he was himself exhausted, there would be a brief cessation, but it would be very brief. With a slash and crack and flourish of the whip, he would shout again, "Dance, niggers, dance," and away they would go once more, pell-mell, while I, spurred by an occasional sharp touch of the lash, sat in a corner, extracting from my violin a marvellous quick-stepping tune. The mistress often upbraided him, declaring she would return to her father's house at Cheneyville. Nevertheless, there were times she could not restrain a burst of laughter on witnessing his uproarious pranks.
With the return
Frequently,
of spring,
we were thus
Anne and
detained
myself
until
conceived
almost
the
morning,
project of taking a farm in the
bent with
neighbourhood.
excessive
I
toil,
had been accustomed
actually
from earliest
suffering
youth
for a little
to
refreshing
agricultural
rest,
labours,
and
it was an
feeling rather
occupation
as if we could
congenial
cast
to my
ourselves
tastes.
upon the
I
earth
accordingly
and
entered into
many a night
arrangements
in
for
the
a part
house
of
of
the old
Edwin
Alden
Epps
farm,
have his
on which my
unhappy
father
slaves been
formerly
made to
resided,
dance and
with
laugh.
one cow, one swine,
Notwithstanding
a yoke
these
of fine
deprivations
oxen I
in
had
order
lately
to
purchased
gratify
of
the
Lewis
whim
Brown
of an
in
unreasonable
Hartford,
master,
and other
we
personal
had to be in
property
the
and
field
effects,
as soon as
we
it was
proceeded
light,
to our new
and
home
during
in
the day
Kingsbury.
performed the
That
ordinary
year,
and
I planted
accustomed task.
25 acres of corn,
Such
sowed
deprivations
large
could not
fields
be
of oats,
urged at the
and
scales
commenced
in
farming upon as
extenuation of
large a
any
scale
lack of
as
weight,
my utmost means
or
would
in the
permit.
cornfield for not
Anne was
hoeing with the
diligent
usual
about the house
rapidity.
affairs, while
The
I
whippings
toiled
were just as
laboriously in
severe
the
as if
field.
we had gone forth
On
in
this
the morning,
place we continued to
strengthened and
reside
invigorated
until
by a night's repose.
1834. In the
Indeed,
winter season,
after such
I had
frantic
numerous
revels,
calls to play
he
on
was
the violin.
always more sour
Wherever the
and
young
savage
people
than before,
assembled to dance,
punishing
I was
for
almost
slighter causes
invariably there.
and using the
Throughout
whip
the
with
surrounding
increased and
villages,
more
my fiddle was
vindictive energy.
notorious. Anne,
10 years
also,
I
during her
toiled for that
long
man
residence
without
at the Eagle
reward.
Tavern, had
10
become
years
somewhat
of my
famous as a
incessant
cook.
labour has
During court
contributed
weeks
to increase
and on
the
public
bulk of his
occasions,
possessions.
she was employed at
10
high
years
wages
I was
in the
compelled
kitchen
to
at
address him
Sherrill's
with
coffee house.
downcast eyes
We
and
always returned
uncovered
home
head,
from the
in the
performance of these
attitude and
services
language
with
of a
money in our
slave.
pockets.
I am
So that
indebted
with
to him
fiddling,
for nothing,
cooking, and farming,
save
we soon
undeserved
found
abuse
ourselves in
and
the possession
stripes.
of abundance.
Beyond
And,
the
in
reach
fact,
of his
leading a
inhuman
happy
thong,
and prosperous
and
life.
standing on the soil
Well,
of the free
indeed,
state
would it have
where I
been
was
for
born,
us had
thanks
we
be to
remained
heaven,
on the farm
I
at
can raise
Kingsbury.
my head once
But the
more
time
among
came
men.
when the next
I
step
can
was to
speak
be
of the
taken
wrongs I
towards the
have
cruel
suffered,
destiny
and
that
of
awaited
those
me.
who inflicted them,
In
with
March
upraised eyes.
1834, we removed
But
to
I have no
Saratoga
desire
Springs.
to speak of
We
him
occupied
or
a house
any other
belonging
one
to Daniel
otherwise than
O'Brien
truthfully.
on the north side of
Yet to
Washington
speak
Street.
truthfully of
At
Edwin
that time,
Epps
Isaac
would be to
Taylor
say
kept a
he
large
is a
boarding
man in
house
whose
known
heart
as
the
Washington
quality of
Hall
kindness
at the north
or
end
of
of
justice
Broadway.
is not
He
found.
employed me to
A
drive a
rough,
hack,
rude
in
energy,
which capacity I
united
worked
with an
for him 2
uncultivated
years.
mind and an
After this
avaricious
time,
spirit,
I was
are
generally
his
employed
prominent
through the visiting
characteristics.
season, as
He is
also
known
was
as a
Anne, in
nigger
the
breaker,
United States Hotel,
distinguished for
and
his
other
faculty
public
of
houses
subduing
of
the
the place.
spirit of the
In
slave,
winter
and
seasons,
priding
I relied
himself
upon
upon
my
his
violin,
reputation in this
though
respect,
during the
as a
construction of the
jockey
Troy
boasts
and
of his
Saratoga
skill in
Railroad,
managing a
I performed
refractory
many
horse.
hard days'
He
labour
looked
upon
upon
it.
a coloured
I was
man,
in the habit,
not as a
at
human being,
Saratoga,
responsible
of
to his
purchasing
creator
articles
for the
necessary
small
for my
talent
family
entrusted
at the
to him,
stores of Mr.
but as a
Cephas Parker
chattel
and Mr.
personal,
William Perry,
as mere
gentlemen
live property,
towards whom,
no
for
better,
many acts of
except in
kindness,
value,
I
than his
entertained
mule or
feelings
dog.
of strong regard.
When the
It was for
evidence,
this reason
clear
that,
and
12 years
indisputable,
afterwards,
was
I
laid
caused
before
to be
him that I
directed
was a
to
free
them the
man,
letter, which
and
is
as much
hereafter
entitled to my
inserted,
liberty
and
as
which was
he.
the means, in
When,
the
on the
hands of
day I
Mr.
left,
Northup,
he
of
was
my
informed
fortunate
that I had a
deliverance.
wife and children,
While living
as
at the
dear to
United
me
States
as his
Hotel,
own
I
babes to
frequently
him,
met with
he
slaves
only
who
raved
had
and
accompanied
swore,
their masters from the
denouncing the
south.
law that tore me
They
from
were
him,
always well
and
dressed
declaring
and
he
well
would
provided
find out
for,
the man who
leading
had forwarded
apparently
the
an easy
letter that
life,
disclosed
with
the
but
place
few
of my
of its ordinary
captivity,
troubles
if
to
there was
perplex
any
them.
virtue or power
Many
in
times
money,
they entered
and
into
would take
conversation
his
with
life.
me on the subject
He
of
thought of
slavery.
nothing but his
Almost
loss,
uniformly,
and cursed
I
me
found
for
they
having been
cherished a
born
secret
free.
desire for liberty.
He could
Some
have
of them
stood
expressed
unmoved
the
and
most
seen the
ardent
tongues of
anxiety
his
to
poor
escape,
slaves
and
torn out
consulted
by
me
the
on the
roots.
best method of
He could
effecting
have
it.
seen them
The
burned
fear
to
of
ashes
punishment,
over a
however,
slow fire,
which they knew
or
was
gnawed
certain
to
to
death
attend
by
their
dogs,
recapture and
if it
return,
only
in
brought him
all
profit.
cases proved sufficient
Such
to
a
deter
hard,
them from the
cruel,
experiment.
unjust
Having
man
all my
is
life
Edwin
breathed
Epps.
the free air of the north,
There was but
and conscious
one
that I
greater
possessed
savage
the same
on Bayou
feelings and
birth than he.
affections that find a
Jim
place in
Burns'
the white man's
plantation was
breast,
cultivated,
conscious,
as
moreover,
already be mentioned exclusively by women.
Some men at least,
that barbarians kept their backs so ignorant and raw that they could not perform the customary labour demanded daily of the slave.
Abject
He
condition
boasted
of
his
slave.
cruelty,
I
and
could not
through
comprehend
all the
justice
round
of that
was
law,
accounted a
or
more
that religion
thoroughgoing,
which
energetic man
upholds
than
or
even
recognises
Epps.
the
A
principle of
brute
slavery.
himself, Jim Burns
never
had
once,
not a particle of mercy for his
did I fail
subject
to
brutes,
counsel anyone
and,
who
like
came
a
to me,
fool,
to watch his opportunity
scourged away
and
the
strike
very
for
strength
freedom.
upon which
I
depended
continued to
his
reside
amount
at
of gain.
Saratoga until the spring of
Epps remained on
1841.
Huff Power
The
2
flattering
years,
anticipations
when,
which,
having
7 years
accumulated a
before,
considerable
had
sum of
seduced us
money,
from the
he
quiet
expended
farmhouse
it in
on
the
the east
purchase of the
side of the
plantation
Hudson
on the
had
east
not been
bank of Bayou
realized.
Boeuf,
Though
where he
always in
still
comfortable
continues to reside.
circumstances, we had not
He
prospered.
took possession of it
The
in
society and
1845,
associations
after the
at that
holidays were
world-renowned
passed.
watering
He
place
carried
were
thither
not
with him
calculated
9
to
slaves,
preserve the simple
all of whom,
habits of
except
industry
myself
and economy
and
to which
Susan,
I
who
had been
has since
accustomed,
died, remain
but,
there
on the
yet.
contrary, to
He made
substitute
no
others
addition
in
to
their
this
stead,
force,
tending
and
to
for 8
shiftlessness
years the
and
following were my
extravagance.
companions
At
in
this
his
time,
quarters,
we were the
viz.
parents
Abram,
of 3 children,
Wiley,
Elizabeth,
Phoebe,
Margaret,
Bob, Henry,
and Alonzo.
Edward,
Elizabeth,
and Patsy.
the eldest,
All
was
these,
in her
except
10th year.
Edward, born
Margaret
since,
was 2
were
years
purchased
younger,
out of a
and little
drove by
Alonzo
Epps
had just
during the
passed
time
his
he was
5th birthday.
overseer for
They
Archie
filled
B.
our house
Williams,
with gladness.
whose
Their
plantation
young
is
voices
situated
were
on the
music
shore
in
of
our
Red
ears.
River, not
Many
far
an
from
airy
Alexandria.
castle did their mother and
Abram
myself
was
build
tall,
for the little
standing a
innocents.
full head
When
above
not at
any
labour,
common man.
I was always walking
He is
with them,
60 years of
clad in their
age
best
and was
attire,
born in
through the
Tennessee.
streets and groves
20
of
years
Saratoga.
ago, he was
Their
purchased
presence
by a
was my
trader,
delight,
carried
and I
into
clasped
South
them to my
Carolina,
bosom with
and
as
sold
warm
to
and
James
tender love
Buford
as
of
if their
Williamsburg
clouded
County
skins had
in
been
that
as white
state.
as snow.
In his youth, he was
Thus
renowned
far,
for his
the
great
history of
strength,
my life presents
but
nothing
age and
whatever
unremitting
unusual,
toil have
nothing
somewhat
but the
shattered
common
his
hopes
powerful
and
frame
loves
and
and labours
enfeebled his
of an
mental
obscure
faculties.
coloured man, making his
Wiley
humble
is
progress
48.
in the world.
He was
But
born
now
on the
I had
estate
reached a
of
turning
William
point in
Tassel,
my existence,
and for many
reached
years
the
took
threshold
charge of that
of
gentleman's
unutterable
ferry
wrong
over the Big
and
Black
sorrow
River
and
in
despair.
South Carolina.
Now had I approached
Phoebe was
within
a
the
slave
shadow
of
of the
Buford,
cloud,
Tassel's
into
neighbour,
the thick
and
darkness
having
whereof
married
I was
Wiley,
soon to
he bought the
disappear,
latter at her
thenceforward to be
instigation.
hidden from the eyes
Buford
of all
was
my
a kind
kindred,
master,
and shut
sheriff
out
of the
from the
county,
sweet light
and
of liberty
in those days
for
a
many
man of
a
wealth.
weary year.
Bob and Henry are
chapter
Phoebe's
1.
children, by a former husband, their father having been abandoned to give place to Wiley. That seductive youth had insinuated himself into Phoebe's affections,
Chapter 2
and
of
therefore
12
the
Years a
faithless
Slave
spouse
by
had
Solomon
gently
Northup.
kicked her first
This
husband out
LibriVox
of her
recording
cabin
is in
door.
the public domain.
Edward had been born to them on Bayou
One
Huff
morning,
Power.
towards the latter
Patsy
part of
is
the month
23,
of March
also from
1841,
Buford's plantation.
having at that time
She
no
is in
particular
no
business
wise
to
connected
engage my
with the
attention,
others, but
I was
glories
walking
in the
about the
fact
village
that
of
she is the
Saratoga
offspring of
Springs,
a
thinking
Guinea
to
nigger,
myself where I
brought
might
over to
obtain some
Cuba in a
present
slave ship,
employment
and
until
in the
the
course
busy
of
season
trade
should arrive.
transferred to Buford,
Anne,
who
as
was her
her
mother's
usual
owner.
custom, had gone over
This,
to
as I
Sandy
learned
Hill,
from them,
a
is a
distance of some
genealogical
20
account
miles,
of my
to take
master's
charge
slaves.
of the culinary
For
department
years
at
they had been
Cheryl's
together.
Coffee House during the
Often
session
they
of the
recalled the
court.
memories of
Elizabeth,
other days,
I think,
and
had
sighed to
accompanied her.
retrace their steps
Margaret
to the
and
old
Alonzo
home in
were with
Carolina.
their aunt at
Troubles
Saratoga.
came upon their
On the
master
corner
Buford,
of Congress
which
Street
brought
and
far
Broadway,
greater troubles
near the
upon
tavern,
them.
then, and for
He
aught I
became
know to the
involved in
contrary,
debt,
still
and
kept by
unable to
Mr.
bear
Moon.
up against
I
his
was met
failing
by two
fortunes,
gentlemen of
was
respectable
compelled to sell
appearance,
these
both
and
of whom
others
were
of his
entirely
slaves.
unknown to me.
In
I
a
have the
chain gang,
impression
they
that
had
they
been
were
driven from
introduced to me
beyond the
by someone
Mississippi
of my
to the
acquaintances,
plantation of
but
Archie
who
B.
I have in
Williams.
vain endeavoured to
Edwin
recall,
Epps,
with the
who for a
remark
long
that I was an
while had been
expert
his
player
driver
on the
and overseer,
violin.
was
At any
about
rate, they
establishing
immediately
himself in
entered into
business on his
conversation
own
on that
account
subject,
at the time of their
making
arrival,
numerous
and
inquiries
accepted
touching my
them in
proficiency
payment of
in
his
that
wages.
respect.
Old
My
Abram
responses
was a
being to all
kind-hearted being,
appearances
a sort
satisfactory,
of
they
patriarch among
proposed
us,
to engage my
fond of
services for a short
entertaining his
period,
younger brethren
stating at
with
the same
grave
time
and
I
serious
was just
discourse.
such a person as
He
their
was deeply
business
versed in
required.
such
Their
philosophy
names,
as is
as
taught
they
in the
afterwards
cabin of
gave
the
them to
slave.
me, were
But
Merrill
the great
Brown
absorbing
and Abram
hobby
Hamilton,
of Uncle Abram
though
was
whether these
General
were their
Jackson,
true
whom
appellations,
his young
I have
master
strong
in
reasons to
Tennessee
doubt.
had followed to the
The
wars.
former was a man
He
apparently
loved to
40
wander
years
back
of age,
in imagination
somewhat
to the
short
place
and
where he was
thick-set,
born,
with a
and to
countenance
recount the
indicating
scenes of his
shrewdness
youth
and intelligence.
during those stirring
He wore a
times when
black
the
frock
nation
coat
was in
and
arms.
black hat,
He
and
had
said
been
he resided
athletic
either at
and more
Rochester
keen and
or at
powerful Syracuse. Than the generality of his race.
A young man of fair
now his
complexion
eye
and
had
light
become
eyes,
dim, and his natural force
had not
abated.
passed the age
Very
of
often,
25.
indeed,
He
while
was
discussing
tall and
the best
slender,
method of
dressed
baking
in
the
a
hoe cake,
snuff-coloured coat,
or
with
expatiating
glossy
at
hat
large upon
and
the
vest
glory
of
of Jackson,
elegant pattern.
he would forget
His
where he
whole
left his
apparel
hat,
was in the
or his
extreme of
hoe,
fashion.
or his basket,
His appearance
and
was somewhat
then would the
effeminate,
old man be
but
laughed at
prepossessing,
if Epps was
and
absent,
there was about him
and
an
whipped
easy air
if he
that
was
showed
present.
he had mingled
So
with the
was he
world.
perplexed
They were
continually,
connected,
and
as they
sighed
informed
to
me,
think that he
with
was
a
growing
circus
aged
company,
and going to
then
decay.
in the city of Washington.
Philosophy and
That
they were on their way thither to rejoin it, having left it for a short time
it was
to make an
evident that all
excursion
of them
northward
combined were
for the
fast
purpose
bringing
of seeing
down
the
the grey
country,
hairs of
and were
Uncle
paying
Abram
their
to the grave.
expenses by an occasional
And Phoebe
exhibition.
had been an
They
excellent
also
field hand,
remarked
but
that they had
latterly
found
was
much
put into the
difficulty
kitchen,
in
where she
procuring
remained,
music for their
except occasionally
entertainments,
in a time
and that
of
if I would
uncommon
accompany
hurry.
them as far as New
She
York,
was a sly
they would
old
give me
creature,
$1
and
for
when
each
not in the
day's
presence
services,
of her mistress
and
or her
$3
master,
in addition
was
for
garrulous
every
in the
night I
extreme.
played at their
Wiley,
performances,
on the contrary,
besides
was silent.
sufficient to pay the
He performed
expenses
his
of my
task
return
without
from New
murmur or
York to
complaint,
Saratoga.
seldom
I at
indulging
once
in the luxury
accepted
of
the
speech,
tempting offer,
except
both
to
for
utter
the
a wish
reward
that
it
he was
promised
away from
and
Epps,
from a desire
and
to
back
visit the
once more
metropolis.
in South
They were
Carolina.
anxious to leave immediately.
Bob and Henry
Thinking my
had reached
absence
the
would be
ages
brief,
of 20
I did
and
not deem it
23,
necessary
and
to
were
write to
distinguished
Anne
for
whither
nothing
I had gone.
extraordinary or
In fact,
unusual,
supposing that
while
my
Edward,
return,
a lad
perhaps,
of
would be
13,
as soon as
not
hers.
yet able to
So,
maintain
taking
his
a
row in
change
the
of linen
corn or
and
the
my
cotton
violin,
field,
I was
kept
ready
in
to
the great
depart.
house to
The
wait
carriage
on
was
the little
brought round,
Eppses.
a covered one,
Patsy
drawn
was
by a
slim
pair
and
of noble
straight.
bays,
She stood
altogether
erect as the
forming an
human
elegant
form is capable
establishment.
of standing.
Their
There was an
baggage,
air of
consisting of
loftiness in
3
her
large
movement
trunks,
that neither
was
labour
fastened on the
nor
rack,
weariness
and
nor
mounting to the
punishment could
driver's seat,
destroy.
while they
Truly,
took their
Patsy
places
was
in
a
the rear,
splendid animal,
I drove away
and
from
were it not
Saratoga
that bondage
on
had
the road to
enshrouded
Albany,
her intellect
elated
in
with
utter
my
and
new position,
everlasting
and
darkness,
happy as
would
I
have
had
been
ever
chief
been
among
on any day
10,000
in
of her
all my
people.
life.
She could
We
leap the
passed
highest
through
fences,
Ballston,
and a
striking
fleet
the
hound
ridge
it was
road,
indeed
as it is
that could
called, if
outstrip
my
her in a
memory
race.
correctly serves me,
No horse could
followed it
fling her
direct
from
to
his back.
Albany.
She
We
was a
reached that
skillful
city
teamster.
before dark,
She
and
turned as
stopped
true
at
a
a
furrow
hotel
as the best,
southward from the
and at
museum.
splitting rails
This
there was
night I
none
had
who
an
could excel
opportunity
her.
of witnessing one
When
of their
the order to
performances,
halt was
the
heard at
only
night,
one
she
during the
would
whole
have her
period
mules
I
at the
was with
crib,
them.
unharnessed,
Hamilton was
fed
stationed
and
at the
curried
door.
before
I
Uncle
formed
Abram
the
had found
orchestra,
his hat.
while Brown
Not,
provided the
however, for
entertainment.
all or any
It
of these
consisted
was she
in
chiefly
throwing
famous.
balls, dancing on
Such
the rope,
lightning-like
frying
motion was in
pancakes
her
in
fingers
a hat,
as no other
causing
fingers
invisible
ever
pigs
possessed,
to squeal,
and therefore
and
it
other
was
like
that
feats
in
of
cotton-picking
ventriloquism
time
and
Patsy was
legerdemain.
queen of the
The
field.
audience was
She
extraordinarily
had a
sparse,
genial and
not
pleasant
of the
temper,
selectest
and
character
was
at that,
faithful and
and
obedient.
Hamilton's report
Naturally,
of the
she was a
proceeds
joyous
presented
creature,
but
a
beggarly
laughing,
account
light-hearted
of
girl,
empty boxes.
rejoicing in the mere
Early
sense
next
of
morning,
existence.
we renewed our journey.
Yet Patsy
The burden
wept
of their
oftener
conversation
and
now
suffered more
was the
than
expression
any
of
of
an
her
anxiety
companions.
to reach the
She had
circus
been
without
literally
delay.
excoriated.
They hurried forward
Her
without
back
again
bore the
stopping
scars
to
of
exhibit,
1,000 stripes,
and in due course
not
of
because
time
she was
we
backward
reached
in
New
her
York,
work,
taking
nor
lodgings
because she
at
was
a
of
house
an
on the
unmindful
west
and
side of the
rebellious
city,
spirit,
in a
but
street
because
running
it
from
had fallen
Broadway
to her
to the
lot
river.
to be the slave of
I
a
supposed my
licentious
journey
master
was at an
and a
end,
jealous
and expected
mistress.
in a day or two at
She
least to
shrank
return
before
to
the
my
lustful
friends
eye
and
of the
family
one,
at Saratoga.
and was in danger
Brown and
even of her
Hamilton,
life
however,
at the hands
began
of
to
the other,
importune me
and
to
between the
continue with
two
them to
she
Washington.
was indeed
They
accursed.
alleged that immediately on their
In the
arrival,
great house,
now
for
that the
days
summer
together,
season was
there were
approaching,
high and
the
angry
circus would
words,
set out for the
poutings
north.
and
They
estrangement,
promised me a
whereof
situation
she was
and
the
high
innocent
wages
cause.
if I would accompany them.
Nothing
Largely
delighted the
did they
mistress so
expatiate
much
on the
as to see her
advantages that would
suffer,
result to me,
and more than
such
once,
were the flattering
when Epps had
representations
refused
they
to
made
sell her,
that I finally
has she
concluded
tempted me
to
with
accept
bribes
the
to
offer.
put her secretly
The
to
next
death,
morning they
and bury
suggested
her
that,
body in some
inasmuch as
lonely
we were
place
about
in the
entering
margin
a
of the
slave
swamp.
state, it would be as well,
Gladly would
before
Patsy
leaving
have
New York,
appeased this
to procure
unforgiving
free
spirit
papers.
if it had
The
been in her
idea struck
power,
me as a prudent
but
one,
not like
though I
Joseph
think it would
dared she
scarcely have
escape
occurred
from
to me
Master
had
Epps,
they not
leaving
proposed
her
it.
garment in
We
his hand.
proceeded at once to what
Patsy
I
walked
understood
under
to
a
be the
cloud.
custom house.
If she uttered
They
a
made
word
oath
in
to
opposition
certain
to her
facts,
master's
showing
will,
I was a
the
free
lash
man.
was
A
resorted to
paper
at
was
once
drawn up
to
and
bring her
handed
to
us with the
subjection.
direction to take
If she
it to
was
the
not
clerk's
watchful
office.
when about her
We
cabin,
did so,
or
and
when
the clerk,
walking in the
having
yard,
added something
a
to
billet
it,
of
for
wood,
which he
or
was
a
paid
broken
6
bottle
shillings,
perhaps,
we
hurled
returned
from her
again to the
mistress's
custom
hand,
house.
would smite
Some
her
further
unexpectedly in the
formalities were
face.
gone through with
The
before it was
enslaved
completed,
victim of lust
when,
and
and hate,
paying the officer
Patsy had
$2,
no
I
comfort in
placed
her
the
life.
papers in my pocket and
These were my
started with my two
companions and
friends to
fellow
our
slaves,
hotel.
with whom I was
thought at the
accustomed to
time,
be
I
driven
must
to the
confess,
field,
that the
and with
papers
whom
were
it has
scarcely
been my
worth
lot
the
to
cost of
dwell for
obtaining
10
them.
years in the
The
log cabins
apprehension
of
of danger
Edwin
to my
Epps.
personal safety
They,
never
if
having
living,
suggested
are
itself
yet
to me in
toiling
the
on the
remotest
banks
manner.
of Bayou Boeuf,
The clerk,
never
to whom
destined
we were
to breathe,
directed, I
as
remember,
I
made
now
a
do,
memorandum
the
in a
blessed
large
air
book,
of liberty,
which, I
nor
presume,
to shake
is
off
in the
the
office
heavy
yet.
shackles that
A
enthrall them,
reference to the
until
entries
they shall
during the
lie
latter
down
part
forever
of March
in the dust.
or 1st of April
End of chapter
1841,
13.
I have no doubt will satisfy the incredulous, at least as far as this particular transaction is concerned. With the evidence of freedom in my possession, the next day after our arrival in New York,
Chapter
we crossed the
14
ferry
of 12
to Jersey
Years a
City
Slave
and
by
took the
Solomon
road to
Northup.
Philadelphia. This
Here we
LibriVox
remained
recording
one
is in the
night,
public
continuing
domain.
our journey
The
towards
first
Baltimore
year of Epps'
early in the
residence
morning.
on the bayou,
In due time, we
1845,
arrived in the latter
caterpillars
city
almost
and
totally
stopped at a
destroyed the
hotel
cotton
near the
crop
railroad
throughout the
depot,
region.
either
There was
kept by
little
a
to be
Mr.
done,
Rathbone,
so that the
or
slaves
known
were
as the Rathbone
necessarily
House.
idle half the time.
All the way from New York,
However,
their
there came a
anxiety to
rumor
reach
to
the
Bayou
circus
Boeuf
seemed
that
to grow
wages
more
were
and
high
more intense.
and laborers in
We
great
left the
demand
carriage at
on the sugar
Baltimore, and
plantations
entering
in
the
St.
cars,
Mary's
proceeded
Parish.
to Washington,
This parish
at
is
which place we
situated on the
arrived
coast of
just
the
at
Gulf of
nightfall,
Mexico,
the evening
about
previous to the funeral of
140
General
miles from
Harrison,
Avoyelles.
and stopped
The
at
Rio
Gadsby's
Teche,
Hotel
a considerable
on Pennsylvania
stream,
Avenue.
flows through
After
St.
supper,
Mary's to
they
the
called
Gulf.
me to their apartments
It was
and paid
determined
me
by the planters,
$43,
on the
a
receipt of
sum
this
greater than
intelligence,
my wages
to make
amounted
up a
to,
drove of
which
slaves to be
act of
sent down to
generosity was in
Tuckapaw in St.
consequence, they
Mary's,
said,
for the
of their
purpose
not
of
having
hiring them
exhibited
out
as
in the
often
cane
as
fields.
they had given me to
Accordingly,
anticipate
in the
during
month
our
of
trip
September,
from Saratoga.
there were
They moreover
147
informed
collected
me
at
that it
Holmesville,
had been the intention
Abram,
of the
Bob, and
circus company
myself among
to
the
leave
number.
Washington the next
Of
morning,
these, about
but
one
that,
half
on
were
account
women.
of the funeral,
Epps,
they had concluded to
Pace,
remain another
Henry
day.
Tolle,
They
and
were
Addison
then,
Roberts
as they had
were
been
the
from
white
the
men
time of our
selected
first
to accompany
meeting,
and
extremely
take
kind.
charge of the drove.
No
They
opportunity
had
was
a
omitted
two-horse
of
carriage
addressing me
and
in the
two
language
saddle
of
horses for their
approbation,
use.
while,
A large
on the other
wagon,
hand,
drawn
I
by
was
4
certainly
horses
much
and
prepossessed
driven
in
by
their
John,
favour.
a boy
I gave
belonging
them
to
my
Mr.
confidence
Roberts,
without
carried
reserve,
the blankets
and would
and
freely have
provisions.
trusted them to almost
About
any
2
extent.
o'clock in the afternoon,
Their constant
having been
conversation
fed,
and manner towards me,
preparations were made
their
to depart.
foresight in suggesting
The
the
duty
idea of
assigned
free
me
papers,
was to
and
take
100
charge of the
other little
blankets and
acts,
provisions,
unnecessary
and
to be
see that
repeated,
none were lost
all
by the way.
indicated that they were
The
friends
carriage
indeed,
proceeded in
sincerely
advance, the
solicitous
wagon
for my
following.
welfare.
Behind
I know
this, the
not,
slaves
but they
were
were.
arranged,
I
while
know
the
not,
2
but they were
horsemen
innocent
brought
of
up
the
the rear,
great wickedness
and
of
in
which I
this
now
order the
believe them
procession
guilty.
moved out of
Whether they
Holmesville.
were accessory to
That
my
night we reached a
misfortunes,
Mr. McCrow's
subtle and
plantation,
inhuman
a
monsters in the
distance of
shape
10
of
or
men,
15 miles,
designedly
when we were
luring me
ordered to
away from
halt.
home and family
Large
and
fires were
liberty,
built,
for the
and
sake
each
of gold.
one spreading his
Those who
blanket
read
on the
these
ground.
pages will have
The
the
white
same
men
means
lodged
of
in the great
determining
house.
as myself.
An hour
If they
before
were
day,
innocent,
we were
my
aroused by
sudden
the drivers
disappearance
coming
must
among
have
us,
been
cracking their
unaccountable
whips
indeed.
and ordering us to
But
arise.
revolving
Then
in my
the
mind
blankets
all
were
the
rolled up,
attending
and being
circumstances,
severally
I never
delivered to
yet
me
could
and
indulge
deposited in the
towards them
wagon,
so
the
charitable
procession
a
set forth
supposition.
again.
After
The following
receiving
night
the money
it
from
rained
them,
violently.
of which they
We were
appeared to
all
have
drenched,
an abundance,
our
they
clothes
advised me not
saturated
to
with
go
mud
into
and
the streets
water.
that night,
Reaching an
inasmuch
open
as I
shed,
was
formerly
unacquainted
a
with the
gin
customs
house,
of the
we
city.
found beneath it
Promising
such
to
shelter
remember
as it
their
afforded.
advice, I left
There
them
was not
together,
room for
and
all of
soon
us to
after
lay
was
down.
shown by a coloured
There
servant
we
to a
remained,
sleeping room
huddled
in the
together
back part
through
of
the
the
night,
hotel, on the
continuing
ground
our
floor.
march as
I
usual
laid
in
down
the
to
morning.
rest, thinking
During
of
the
home
journey
and
we were
wife
fed
and
twice a
children,
day,
and the long
boiling our
distance
bacon
that
and
stretched
baking
between
our
us
corn cake
until I
at the
fell
fires
asleep.
in the same manner
But
as in
no
our
good
huts.
angel of pity
We
came
passed
to my
through
bedside,
Lafayetteville,
bidding me to
Mountsville,
fly. No
Newtown,
voice of
to
mercy
Centerville,
forewarned me
where
in my
Bob and
dreams
Uncle
of the
Abram were
trials
hired.
that were just at
Our
hand.
number decreased as
The
we
next
advanced.
day there was a
Nearly
great
every sugar
pageant in
plantation
Washington.
requiring the
The roar of
services of
cannon
one
and
or
the
more.
tolling of bells filled
On
the
our
air,
route we
while
passed
many
the Grand
houses were
Coteau,
shrouded with
or
crape
prairie,
and the
a
streets
vast
were black
space
with
of
people.
level,
As
monotonous
the day
country,
advanced, the
without a
procession
tree
made its
except an
appearance,
occasional
coming
one
slowly
which had
through
been
the avenue,
transplanted near some
carriage after
dilapidated
carriage
building.
in long
It was
succession,
once
while
thickly
thousands
populated
upon
and
thousands
under
followed on
cultivation,
foot,
but for
all
some
moving
cause
to
had
the
been
sound of
abandoned.
melancholy music.
The business of the
They were
scattered
bearing the dead
inhabitants that
body of
now
Harrison
dwell upon
to
it
the grave.
is principally
From
raising
early
cattle.
in the morning, I was
Immense
constantly
herds
in
were
the
feeding
company
upon
of
it as we
Hamilton and
passed.
Brown. They
In
were
the
the only
centre of the
persons I
Grand
knew
Coteau,
in Washington.
one feels
We
as if he
stood
were on the
together
ocean,
as the funeral
out of
pomp
sight of
passed
land.
by. I
As
remember
far as the eye
distinctly
can see,
how the
in
window
all
glass would
directions,
break and
it is
rattle to
but
the
a
ground
ruined and
after each
deserted
report
waste.
of the cannon they were
I was
firing in the
hired to
burial
Judge
ground.
Turner,
We
a
went to the
distinguished man
Capitol
and
and
extensive
walked a
planter,
long time
whose whose large estate is situated on Bayou Sal, within a few miles of the Gulf.
All the time
Bay o' Sal is a small stream flowing into the Bay of Atchafalaya.
As yet,
For some days I was employed at Turner's in repairing his sugar house, when a cane knife was put into my hand, and with 30 or 40 others, I was
several
sent into
times
the field.
during the afternoon.
I found no such difficulty in learning the art of cutting cane that I had in picking cotton.
So far
came
as
to
I
me
knew
naturally
them, of
and
indulging to
intuitively,
excess.
and in a
On
short
these
time
occasions,
I was able
after
to
serving
keep up with the
themselves,
fastest
they would
knife.
pour out a glass
Before the
and hand
cutting
it
was
to me.
over, however,
I did not become
Judge Tanner
intoxicated,
transferred me from
as
the
may be
field to the
inferred
sugar house
from what
to
subsequently
act there
occurred.
in the capacity of driver.
Towards evening,
From the time
and
of the
soon after
commencement of
partaking
sugar
of one of
making
these
to the close,
potations,
the
I began
grinding
to
and boiling
experience
does not
most
cease
unpleasant
day or night.
sensations.
The whip was given me with directions
My head
to use it
commenced
upon
aching.
anyone who
A
was
dull,
caught
heavy
standing
pain,
idle.
inexpressibly
If I failed to
disagreeable.
obey them to the
At
letter,
the supper
there
table,
was another
I
one
was
for my
without
own back.
appetite. The
In
sight
addition
and
to
flavour
this,
of food
my
was
duty was to
nauseous.
call on and
About
off the
dark,
different
the
gangs
same
at the proper
servant
time.
conducted me
I
to
had
the room
no
I had
regular
occupied
periods
the
of
previous
rest
night.
and could
Brown
never
and
snatch but
Hamilton
a few
advised
moments
me
of
to
sleep
retire,
at a time.
commiserating
It
me
is the
kindly,
custom in
and
Louisiana,
expressing
as I
hopes that I
presume
would
it
be
is
better
in
in the
other
morning.
slave states, to
Divesting
allow the
myself
slave
of
to
coat
retain
and
whatever
boots merely,
compensation
I
he
threw
may
myself
obtain for
upon the bed.
services performed on
It was
Sundays.
impossible to
In this
sleep.
way only
The pain
are
in my
they
head
able to
continued
provide
to
themselves
increase
with any
until it
luxury
became
or
almost
convenience
unbearable.
whatever. When
In
a
a short
slave
time, I
purchased
became
or
thirsty.
kidnapped in the north
My lips
is
were parched.
transported to a
I could
cabin
think
on
of
Bayou
nothing but
Boeuf,
water,
he is
of
furnished
lakes
with
and
neither
flowing
knife,
rivers,
nor
of
fork,
brooks
nor dish,
where I had
nor
stooped
kettle,
to drink,
nor any
and of
other
the dripping
thing in the
bucket
shape of
rising
crockery
with its
or
cool and
furniture of
overflowing
any
nectar
nature or
from the
description.
bottom of the well.
He is furnished with a
Towards
blanket
midnight,
before he
as near
reaches
as I
there,
could judge,
and
I
wrapping that
arose,
around him,
unable
he can
longer
either
to
stand
bear
up
such
or lie
intensity
down
of
upon the
thirst.
ground, or
I
on
was
a
a
board if
stranger
his
in the
master
house,
has no
and
use
knew
for it.
nothing of its
He is at
apartments.
liberty to
There was
find
no
a
one
gourd in
up,
which to
as I
keep
could
his meal,
observe.
or he
Groping
can eat
about
his
at
corn
random,
from the
I
cob
knew not
just
where,
as he
I
pleases.
found the way
To
at
ask
last
the
to a
master for
kitchen
a
in the
knife
basement.
or skillet
2 or 3
or any
coloured
small
servants were
convenience
moving
of the
through
kind
it, one of
would be
whom,
answered
a
with a
woman,
kick
gave me
or
2
laughed
glasses
at as
of
a
water.
joke. Whatever
It afforded
necessary
momentary
article of
relief,
this nature is
but by the
found in a
time I
cabin
had reached
has
my
been
room again,
purchased with
the
Sunday
same
money.
burning desire of drink,
However
the
injurious
same
to the morals,
tormenting thirst,
it is
had
certainly a
again
blessing
returned.
to the physical
It was
condition
even
of a
more
slave
torturing
to
than
be
before,
permitted to break
as
the
was
Sabbath.
also the wild
Otherwise,
pain
there
in
would
my
be
head,
no way to
if such
provide
a thing
himself
could
with
be.
any utensils,
I was in sore
which
distress,
seem to be
in most
indispensable to him who
excruciating
is
agony.
compelled to
I
be his
seemed
own
to
cook.
stand on the brink of
On
madness.
cane
The
plantations
memory
in
of
sugar
that
time,
night of
there is
horrible
no
suffering
distinction
will
as to the
follow me
days of
to
the
the
week.
grave.
It is well
In the
understood
course of
that
an
all
hour or
hands
more
must
after
labour
my
on the
return
Sabbath,
from the kitchen,
and it is
I was
equally well
conscious of
understood
someone
that
entering my
those
room.
especially who are
There
hired,
seemed to be
as
several,
I was to
a
Judge
mingling
Turner,
of various
and
voices,
others in
but
succeeding
how
years,
many
shall
or who
receive
they were,
remuneration
I
for
cannot
it.
tell.
It is
Whether
usual
Brown and
also,
Hamilton
in
were
the
among
most
them
hurrying
is
time
a
of
mere
cotton
matter of
picking, to
conjecture.
require the same
I
extra
only
service.
remember with any degree
From
of
this source,
distinctness that
slaves
I was
generally
told it
are
was
afforded an
necessary to go
opportunity
to a
of earning
physician
sufficient
and
to
procure
purchase a
medicine,
knife, a
and
kettle,
that pulling on
tobacco,
my
and so
boots,
forth.
without coat or
The
hat,
females,
I followed
discarding
them
the latter
through a long
luxury, are
passageway
apt to
or alley
expend their
into
little
the long
revenue
street.
in the purchase
It
of
ran
gaudy
out at
ribbons,
right angles from
wherewithal to deck
Pennsylvania
their
Avenue.
hair in the
On
merry
the opposite
season of the
side,
holidays.
there was a light burning in a
I
window.
remained in St.
My
Mary's until
impression
the
is
1st
there
of
were then
January,
3
during
persons
which
with me,
time my
but
Sunday
it is
money
altogether
amounted to
indefinite
$10.
and vague,
I met with
and like
other
the
good
memory
fortune,
of a
for
painful
which
dream.
I was indebted to my
Going
violin,
towards the light,
my constant
which I
companion,
imagined
the
proceeded
source
from a
of profit
physician's
and
office,
soother of
and
my
which
sorrows
seemed to
during
recede
years
as
of
I
servitude.
advanced, is the
There
last
was a
glimmering
grand party of
recollection I
whites
can now
assembled
recall.
at Mr.
From that
Yarney's
moment,
in
I was
Centerville, a
insensible.
hamlet
How
in the
long I
vicinity of
remained in that
Turner's
condition,
plantation.
whether
I was
only that
employed to
night
play for them,
or many
and
days and
so
nights,
well pleased
I
were
do
the
not know.
merrymakers with my performance
But when
that a
consciousness
contribution
returned,
was
I
taken for my
found myself
benefit,
alone,
which amounted to
in utter darkness
$17.
and in chains.
With this sum in
The
possession,
pain in my
I
head
was looked
had
upon by my
subsided in a
fellows as a
measure,
millionaire.
but I was very
It
faint
afforded
and
me
weak.
great pleasure to look
I was
at it,
sitting
to
upon a low
count it
bench,
over and
made
over
of
again,
rough
day
boards,
after day.
and without coat
Visions
or
of
hat.
cabin furniture,
I was
of
handcuffed.
water pails, of
Around my
pocket knives,
ankles also
new
were a
shoes and
pair of
coats
heavy
and hats
fetters.
floated through
One
my fancy,
end of a chain was
and up
fastened
through
to a
all
large
rose the
ring in the
triumphant
floor,
contemplation
the other to
that
the
I was
fetters
the
on my
wealthiest
ankles.
nigger
I
on
tried in
Bayou
vain
Boeuf.
to stand upon my
Vessels
feet.
run up the Rio
Waking from
Teche to
such a
Centerville.
painful trance,
While there,
it was
I
some
was bold
time
enough
before I
one
could
day to
collect my
present
thoughts.
myself before the
Where
captain
was
of a
I?
steamer,
What
and
was the
beg
meaning of
permission
these
to hide
chains?
myself among the
Where
freight.
were Brown and Hamilton?
I was emboldened
What had
to
I
risk the
done to
hazard of
deserve
such a step
imprisonment in
from
such a
overhearing a
dungeon?
conversation,
I could
in
not
the course of
comprehend.
which I ascertained he
There
was was a native of the North. I did not relate to him the particulars of my history, but only expressed an ardent desire to escape from slavery to a free state. He pitied me, but said it would be impossible to avoid the vigilant custom house officers in New Orleans, and that detection would subject him to punishment, and his vessel to confiscation. My earnest entreaties evidently excited his sympathies, and doubtless he would have yielded to them, could he have done so with any kind of safety. I was compelled to smother the sudden flame that lighted up in my bosom with sweet hopes of liberation,
and turn my steps once more towards the increasing darkness of despair.
Dim and confused,
Immediately after this event, the drove assembled at Centerville, and several of the owners having arrived and collected the monies due for our services, we were driven back to Bayou Boeuf.
It could not be that a free citizen of New
York,
York,
our return,
who had
while
wronged
passing
no man,
through a small village,
violated
that I
any
caught
law,
sight of
should be
Tibbets,
dealt with
seated in the door of a dirty grocery,
the more I contemplated
looking somewhat
my
seedy
situation,
and out
however,
of repair.
the more I became
Passion and
confirmed
poor
in my
whiskey, I
suspicions.
doubt not, have
It was
ere
a
this
desolate
laid
thought
him on the
indeed.
shelf.
I felt there was
During
no
our
trust
absence,
or
I
mercy
learned
in
from Aunt
unfeeling
Phoebe
man,
and Patsy
and
that the
commending
latter
myself
had been
to the
getting
God of the
deeper and
oppressed,
deeper into
bowed
trouble.
my head upon
The
my
poor
fettered
girl
hands
was truly an
and
object
wept
of pity.
most bitterly.
Old Hogjaw, the name
End
by
of
which
chapter
Epps
2.
was called when the slaves were by themselves, had beaten her more severely and frequently than ever. As surely as he came from Holmesville, elated with liquor, and it was often in those days, he would whip her, merely to gratify the mistress, would punish her to an extent almost beyond endurance, for an offense of which he himself was the sole and irresistible cause. In his sober moments he could not always be prevailed upon to indulge his wife's insatiable thirst for vengeance. To be rid of Patsy, to place her beyond sight or reach, by sale or death, or in any other manner, of late years seemed to be the ruling thought and passion of my mistress. Patsy had been a favorite when a child, even in the great house. She had been petted and admired for her uncommon sprightliness and pleasant disposition. She had been fed many a time, so Uncle Abram said, even on biscuit and milk, when the madam, in her younger days, was wont to call her to the piazza, and fondle her as she would a playful kitten. But a sad change had come over the spirit of the woman. Now only black and angry fiends ministered in the temple of her heart, until she could look on Patsy but with concentrated venom. Mistress Epps was not naturally such an evil woman, after all. She was possessed of the devil, jealousy, it is true, but aside from that, there was much in her character to admire. Her father, Mr. Roberts, resided in Cheneyville, an influential and honorable man, and as much respected throughout the parish as any other citizen. She had been well educated at some institution this side the Mississippi, was beautiful, accomplished, and usually good-humored. She was kind to all of us but Patsy, frequently in the absence of her husband, sending out to us some little dainty from her own table. In other situations, in a different society from that which exists on the shores of Bayou Boeuf, she would have been pronounced an elegant and fascinating woman. An ill wind it was that blew her into the arms of Epps. He respected and loved his wife as much as a coarse nature like his is capable of loving, but supreme selfishness always overmastered conjugal affection. He loved as well as baser natures can, but a mean heart and soul were in that man. He was ready to gratify any whim, to grant any request she made, provided it did not cost too much. Patsy was equal to any two of his slaves in the cotton field. He could not replace her with the same money she would bring. The idea of disposing of her, therefore, could not be entertained. The mistress did not regard her at all in that light. The pride of the haughty woman was aroused. The blood of the fiery Southern boiled at the sight of Patsy, and nothing less than trampling out the life of the helpless bondwoman would satisfy her. Sometimes the current of her wrath turned upon him whom she had just cause to hate, but the storm of angry words would pass over at length, and there would be a season of calm again. At such times Patsy trembled with fear, and cried as if her heart would break, for she knew from painful experience that if mistress should work herself to the red-hot pitch of rage, Epps would quiet her at last with a promise that Patsy should be flogged, a promise he was sure to keep. Thus did pride, and jealousy, and vengeance war with avarice and brute passion in the mansion of my master, filling it with daily tumult and contention. Thus upon the head of Patsy, the simple-minded slave in whose heart God had implanted the seeds of virtue, the force of all these domestic tempests spent itself at last. During the summer succeeding my return from St. Mary's Parish, I conceived a plan of providing myself with food, which, though simple, succeeded beyond expectation. It has been followed by many others in my condition, up and down the bayou,
and of such benefit has it become that I am almost persuaded to look upon myself as a benefactor. That summer the worms got into the bacon. Nothing but ravenous hunger could induce us to swallow it. The weekly allowance of meal scarcely sufficed to satisfy us. It was customary with us, as it is with all in that region, where the allowance is exhausted before Saturday night, or is in such a state as to render it nauseous and disgusting, to hunt in the swamps for coon and opossum. This, however, must be done at night, after the day's work is accomplished. There are planters whose slaves, for months at a time, have no other meat than such as obtained in this manner. No objections are made to hunting, inasmuch as it dispenses with drafts upon the smokehouse, and because every marauding coon that is killed is so much saved from the standing corn. They are hunted with dogs and clubs, slaves not being allowed the use of firearms. The flesh of the coon is palatable, but verily there is nothing in all butcherdom so delicious as a roasted possum. They are a round, rather long-bodied, little animal of a whitish color, with nose like a pig, and caudal extremity like a rat. They burrow among the roots and in the hollows of the gum tree, and are clumsy and slow of motion. They are deceitful and cunning creatures. On receiving the slightest tap of a stick, they will roll over on the ground and feign death. If the hunter leaves him, in pursuit of another without first taking particular pains to break his neck, the chances are, on his return, he is not to be found. The little animal has outwitted the enemy, has played possum, and is off. But after a long and hard day's work, the weary slave feels little like going to the swamp for his supper, and half the time prefers throwing himself on the cabin floor without it. It is for the interest of the master that the servant should not suffer in health from starvation, and it is also for his interest that he should not become gross from overfeeding. In the estimation of the owner, a slave is the most serviceable when in rather a lean and lank condition, such a condition as the racehorse is in when fitted for the course, and in that condition they are generally to be found on the sugar and cotton plantations along Red River. My cabin was within a few rods of the bayou bank, and necessity being indeed the mother of invention, I resolved upon a mode of obtaining the requisite amount of food, without the trouble of resorting nightly to the woods. This was to construct a fish trap. Having in my mind conceived the manner in which it could be done, the next Sunday I set about putting it into practical execution. It may be impossible for me to convey to the reader a full and correct idea of its construction, but the following will serve as a general description. A frame between 2 and 3 feet square is made, and of a greater or less height, according to the depth of water. Boards or slats are nailed on 3 sides of this frame, not so closely, however, as to prevent the water circulating freely through it. A door is fitted into the 4th side, in such a manner that it will slide easily up and down in the grooves cut in the 2 posts. A movable bottom is then so fitted that it can be raised to the top of the frame without difficulty. In the center of the movable bottom, an auger hole is bored, and into this, one end of a handle or round stick is fastened on the underside so loosely that it will turn. The handle ascends from the center of the movable bottom to the top of the frame, or as much higher as is desirable. Up and down this handle, in a great many places, are gimlet holes, through which small sticks are inserted, extending to opposite sides of the frame. So many of these small sticks are running out from the handle in all directions that a fish of any considerable dimensions cannot pass through without hitting one of them. The frame is then placed in the water and made stationary. The trap is set by sliding or drawing up the door, and kept in that position by another stick, one end of which rests in a notch on the inner side, the other end in a notch made in the handle, running up from the center of the movable bottom. The trap is baited by rolling a handful of wet meal and cotton together until it becomes hard, and depositing it in the back part of the frame. A fish swimming through the upraised door towards the bait necessarily strikes one of the small sticks, turning the handle, which displacing the stick supporting the door, the latter falls, securing the fish within the frame. Taking hold of the top of the handle, The movable bottom is then drawn up to the surface of the water, and the fish taken out. There may have been other such traps in use before mine was constructed, but if there were, I had never happened to see one. Bayou Boeuf abounds in fish of large size and excellent quality, and after this time I was very rarely in want of one for myself, or for my comrades. Thus a mine was opened, a new resource was developed, hitherto unthought of by the enslaved children of Africa who toil and hunger along the shores of that sluggish but prolific stream. About the time of which I am now writing, an event occurred in our immediate neighborhood, which made a deep impression upon me, and which shows the state of society existing there, and the manner in which affronts are oftentimes avenged. Directly opposite our quarters, on the other side of the bayou, was situated the plantation of Mr. Marshall. He belonged to a family among the most wealthy and aristocratic in the country. A gentleman from the vicinity of Natchez had been negotiating with him for the purchase of the estate. One day a messenger came in great haste to our plantation, saying that a bloody and fearful battle was going on at Marshall's, that blood had been spilled, and unless the combatants were forthwith separated, the result would be disastrous. On repairing to Marshall's house, a scene presented itself that beggars description. On the floor of one of the rooms lay the ghastly corpse of the man from Natchez, while Marshall, enraged and covered with wounds and blood, was stalking back and forth, breathing out threatenings and slaughter. A difficulty had arisen in the course of their negotiation. High words ensued, when drawing their weapons, the deadly strife began that ended so unfortunately. Marshall was never placed in confinement. A sort of trial or investigation was had at Marksville, when he was acquitted, and returned to his plantation, rather more respected, as I thought, than ever, from the fact that the blood of a fellow being was on his soul. Epps interested himself in his behalf, accompanying him to Marksville, and on all occasions loudly justifying him, but his services in this respect did not afterwards deter a kinsman of this same Marshall from seeking his life also. A brawl occurred between them over a gambling table, which terminated in a deadly feud. Riding up on horseback in front of the house one day, armed with pistols and bowie knife, Marshall challenged him to come forth and make a final settlement of the quarrel, or he would brand him a coward and shoot him like a dog the first opportunity. Not through cowardice, nor from any conscientious scruples in my opinion, but through the influence of his wife, he was restrained from accepting the challenge of his enemy. A reconciliation, however, was effected afterward, since which time they have been on terms of the closest intimacy. Such occurrences, which would bring upon the parties concerned in them merited and condign punishment in the northern states, are frequent on the bayou, and pass without notice, and almost without comment. Every man carries his bowie knife, and when two fall out, they set to work hacking and thrusting at each other, more like savages than civilized and enlightened beings. The existence of slavery in its most cruel form among them has a tendency to brutalize the humane and finer feelings of their nature. Daily witnesses of human suffering, listening to the agonizing screeches of the slave, beholding him writhing beneath the merciless lash, bitten and torn by dogs, dying without attention, and buried without shroud or coffin, it cannot otherwise be expected that they should become brutified and reckless of human life. It is true there are many kind-hearted and good men in the parish of Avoyelles, such men as William Ford, who can look with pity upon the sufferings of a slave, just as there are, all over the world, sensitive and sympathetic spirits, who cannot look with indifference upon the sufferings of any creature which the Almighty has endowed with life. It is not the fault of the slaveholder that he is cruel, so much as it is the fault of the system under which he lives. He cannot withstand the influence of habit and associations that surround him. Taught from earliest childhood, by all that he sees and hears, that the rod is for the slave's back, he will not be apt to change his opinions in maturer years. There may be humane masters, as there certainly are inhuman ones. There may be slaves well clothed, well fed, and happy, as there surely are those half-clad, half-starved, and miserable.
Nevertheless, the institution that tolerates such wrong and inhumanity as I have witnessed is a cruel, unjust, and barbarous one. Men may write fictions portraying lowly life as it is, or as it is not, may expatiate with owlish gravity upon the bliss of ignorance, discourse flippantly from armchairs of the pleasures of slave life, but let them toil with him in the field, sleep with him in the cabin, feed with him on husks, let him behold him scourged, hunted, trampled on, and they will come back with another story in their mouths. Let them know the heart of the poor slave, learn his secret thoughts he dare not utter in the hearing of the white man. Let them sit by him in the silent watches of the night, converse with him in trustful confidence of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and they will find that 99 out of every 100 are intelligent enough to understand their situation, and to cherish in their bosoms the love of freedom, as passionately as themselves. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of 12 Years a Slave by Solomon Northup. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. In consequence of my inability in cotton picking, Epps was in the habit of hiring me out on sugar plantations during the season of cane cutting and sugar making. He received for my services $1 a day, with the money supplying my place on his cotton plantation. Cutting cane was an employment that suited me, and for 3 successive years I held the lead row at Hawkins, leading a gang of from 50 to 100 hands. In a previous chapter, the mode of cultivating cotton is described. This may be the proper place to speak of the manner of cultivating cane. The ground is prepared in beds, the same as it is prepared for the reception of the cotton seed, except it is plowed deeper. Drills are made in the same manner. Planting commences in January, and continues until April. It is necessary to plant a sugar field only once in 3 years. 3 crops are taken before the seed or plant is exhausted. 3 gangs are employed in the operation. 1 draws the cane from the rick, or stack, cutting the top and flags from the stalk, leaving only that part which is sound and healthy. Each joint of the cane has an eye, like the eye of a potato, which sends forth a sprout when buried in the soil. Another gang lays the cane in the drill, placing 2 stalks side by side in such manner that joints will occur once in 4 or 6 inches. The 3rd gang follows with hoes, drawing earth upon the stalks and covering them to the depth of 3 inches. In 4 weeks, at the farthest, the sprouts appear above the ground, and from this time forward grow with great rapidity. A sugar field is hoed 3 times, the same as cotton, save that a greater quantity of earth is drawn to the roots. By the 1st of August, hoeing is usually over. About the middle of September, whatever is required for seed is cut and stacked in ricks, as they are termed. In October, it is ready for the mill or sugar house, and then the general cutting begins. The blade of a cane knife is 15 inches long, 3 inches wide in the middle, and tapering towards the point and handle. The blade is thin, and in order to be at all serviceable, must be kept very sharp. Every 3rd hand takes the lead of 2 others, one of whom is on each side of him. The lead hand, in the first place, with a blow of his knife, shears the flags from the stalk. He next cuts off the top down as far as it's green. He must be careful to sever all the green from the ripe part, inasmuch as the juice of the former sours the molasses, and renders it unsaleable. Then he severs the stalk at the root and lays it directly behind him. His right and left hand companions lay their stalks, when cut in the same manner, upon his. To every 3 hands there's a cart, which follows, and the stalks are thrown into it by the younger slaves, when it's drawn to the sugar house and ground. If the planter apprehends a frost, the cane is windrowed. Windrowing is the cutting the stalks at an early period and throwing them lengthwise in the water furrow, in such a manner that the tops will cover the butts of the stalks. They will remain in this condition 3 weeks or a month without souring, and secure from frost. When the proper time arrives, they're taken up, trimmed, and carted to the sugar house.
In the month of January, the slaves enter the field again to prepare for another crop. The ground is now strewn with the tops and flags cut from the past year's cane. On a dry day, fire is set to this combustible refuse, which sweeps over the field, leaving it bare and clean, and ready for the hoes. The earth is loosened about the roots of the old stubble, and in process of time another crop springs up from the last year's seed. It is the same the year following, but the third year the seed has exhausted its strength, and the field must be ploughed and planted again. The second year the cane is sweeter and yields more than the first, and the third year more than the second. During the 3 seasons I labored on Hawkins' plantation, I was employed a considerable portion of the time in the sugar house. He is celebrated as the producer of the finest variety of white sugar. The following is a general description of his sugar house and the process of manufacture. The mill is an immense brick building standing on the shore of the bayou. Running out from the building is an open shed, at least 100 feet in length and 40 or 50 feet in width. The boiler in which the steam is generated is situated outside the main building. The machinery and engine rest on a brick pier 15 feet above the floor, within the body of the building. The machinery turns 2 great iron rollers, between 2 and 3 feet in diameter and 6 or 8 feet in length. They are elevated above the brick pier and roll in towards each other. An endless carrier, made of chain and wood, like leathern belts used in small mills, extends from the iron rollers out of the main building and through the entire length of the open shed. The carts in which the cane is brought from the field as fast as it is cut are unloaded at the sides of the shed. All along the endless carrier are ranged slave children, whose business it is to place the cane upon it, when it is conveyed through the shed into the main building, where it falls between the rollers, is crushed, and drops upon another carrier that conveys it out of the main building in an opposite direction, depositing it in the top of a chimney upon a fire beneath, which consumes it. It is necessary to burn it in this manner, because otherwise it would soon fill the building, and more especially because it would soon sour and engender disease. The juice of the cane falls into a conductor underneath the iron rollers, and is carried into a reservoir. Pipes convey it from thence into 5 filterers, holding several hogsheads each. These filterers are filled with bone black, a substance resembling pulverized charcoal. It is made of bones calcinated in close vessels, and is used for the purpose of decolorizing, by filtration, the cane juice before boiling. Through these 5 filterers it passes in succession, and then runs into a large reservoir underneath the ground floor, from whence it is carried up, by means of a steam pump, into a clarifier made of sheet iron, where it is heated by steam until it boils. From the first clarifier it is carried in pipes to a second, and a third, and thence into close iron pans, through which tubes pass filled with steam. While in a boiling state it flows through 3 pans in succession, and is then carried in other pipes down to the coolers on the ground floor. Coolers are wooden boxes with sieve bottoms made of the finest wire. As soon as the syrup passes into the coolers, and is met by the air, it grains, and the molasses at once escapes through the sieves into a cistern below. It is then white or loaf sugar of the finest kind, clear, clean, and as white as snow. When cool, it is taken out, packed in hogsheads, and is ready for market. The molasses is then carried from the cistern into the upper story again, and by another process converted into brown sugar. There are larger mills, and those constructed differently from the one thus imperfectly described, but none perhaps more celebrated than this anywhere on Bayou Boeuf. Lambert of New Orleans is a partner of Hawkins. He is a man of vast wealth, holding, as I have been told, an interest in over 40 different sugar plantations in Louisiana. The only respite from constant labor the slave has through the whole year is during the Christmas holidays. Epps allowed us 3, others allow 4, 5, and 6 days, according to the measure of their generosity. It is the only time to which they look forward with any interest or pleasure. They are glad when night comes, not only because it brings them a few hours' repose, but because it brings them one day nearer Christmas. It is hailed with equal delight by the old and the young. Even Uncle Abram ceases to glorify Andrew Jackson, and Patsy forgets her many sorrows, amid the general hilarity of the holidays. It is the time of feasting, and frolicking, and fiddling, the carnival season with the children of bondage. They are the only days when they are allowed a little restricted liberty, and heartily indeed do they enjoy it. It is the custom for one planter to give a Christmas supper, inviting the slaves from neighboring plantations to join his own on the occasion. For instance, one year it's given by Epps, the next by Marshall, the next by Hawkins, and so on. Usually from 300 to 500 are assembled, coming together on foot, in carts, on horseback, on mules, riding double and triple, sometimes a boy and girl, at others a girl and 2 boys, and at others again a boy, a girl, and an old woman. Uncle Abram astride a mule, with Aunt Phoebe and Patsy behind him, trotting towards a Christmas supper, would be no uncommon sight on Bayou Boeuf. Then, too, of all days in the year, they array themselves in their best attire. The cotton coat has been washed clean, the stump of a tallow candle has been applied to the shoes, and if so fortunate as to possess a rimless or a crownless hat, it is placed jauntily on the head. They are welcomed with equal cordiality, however, if they come bareheaded and barefooted to the feast. As a general thing, the women wear handkerchiefs tied about their heads, but if chance has thrown in their way a fiery red ribbon, or a cast-off bonnet of their mistress grandmother, it is sure to be worn on such occasions. Red, the deep blood red, is decidedly the favorite color among the enslaved damsels of my acquaintance. If a red ribbon does not encircle the neck, you will be certain to find all the hair of their woolly heads tied up with red strings of some sort or another. The table is spread in the open air, and loaded with varieties of meat and piles of vegetables. Bacon and cornmeal at such times are dispensed with. Sometimes the cooking is performed in the kitchen on the plantation, at others in the shade of wide branching trees. In the latter case, a ditch is dug in the ground, and wood laid in and burned until it is filled with glowing coals, over which chickens, ducks, turkeys, pigs, and not infrequently the entire body of a wild ox are roasted. They are furnished also with flour, of which biscuits are made, and often with peach and other preserves, with tarts, and every manner and description of pies, except the mince, that being an article of pastry as yet unknown among them. Only the slave who has lived all the years on his scanty allowance of meal and bacon can appreciate such suppers. White people in great numbers assemble to witness the gastronomical enjoyments. They seat themselves at the rustic table, the males on one side, the females on the other. The two between whom there may have been an exchange of tenderness invariably manage to sit opposite, for the omnipresent Cupid disdains not to hurl his arrows into the simple hearts of slaves. Unalloyed and exulting happiness lights up the dark faces of them all. The ivory teeth, contrasting with their black complexions, exhibit 2 long white streaks the whole extent of the table. All round the bountiful board a multitude of eyes roll in ecstasy. Giggling and laughter and the clattering of cutlery and crockery succeed. Cuffy's elbow hunches his neighbor's side, impelled by an involuntary impulse of delight. Nellie shakes her finger at Sambo and laughs, she knows not why, and so the fun and merriment flows on. When the viands have disappeared, and the hungry maws of the children of toil are satisfied, then, next in the order of amusement, is the Christmas dance. My business on these gala days always was to play on the violin. The African race is a music-loving one, proverbially, and many there were among my fellow bondsmen whose organs of tune were strikingly developed, and who could thumb the banjo with dexterity. But at the expense of appearing egotistical, I must, nevertheless, declare that I was considered the Hurla Boule of Bayou Boeuf. My master often received letters, sometimes from a distance of 10 miles, requesting him to send me to play at a ball or festival of the whites. He received his compensation, and usually I also returned with many picayunes jingling in my pockets, the extra contributions of those whose delight I had administered.
In this manner I became more acquainted than I otherwise would, up and down the bayou. The young men and maidens of Holmesville always knew there was to be a jollification somewhere, whenever Platt Epps was seen passing through the town with his fiddle in his hand. "Where are you going now, Platt?" and "What is coming off to-night, Platt?" would be interrogatories issuing from every door and window, and many a time when there was no special hurry, yielding to pressing importunities, Platt would draw his bow, and, sitting astride his mule, perhaps, discourse musically to a crowd of delighted children, gathered around him in the street. Alas, had it not been for my beloved violin, I scarcely can conceive how I could have endured the long years of bondage. It introduced me to great houses, relieved me of many days' labor in the field, supplied me with conveniences for my cabin, with pipes and tobacco and extra pairs of shoes, and oftentimes led me away from the presence of a hard master, to witness scenes of jollity and mirth. It was my companion, the friend of my bosom, triumphing loudly when I was joyful, and uttering its soft, melodious consolations when I was sad. Often, at midnight, when sleep had fled affrighted from the cabin, and my soul was disturbed and troubled with the contemplation of my fate, it would sing me a song of peace. On holy Sabbath days, when an hour or two of leisure was allowed, it would accompany me to some quiet place on the bayou bank, and, lifting up its voice, discourse kindly and pleasantly indeed. It heralded my name round the country, made me friends who otherwise would not have noticed me, gave me an honored seat at the yearly feasts, and secured the loudest and heartiest welcome of them all at the Christmas dance. The Christmas dance! O ye pleasure-seeking sons and daughters of idleness, who move with measured step, listless and snail-like, through the slow-winding cotillon, if you wish to look upon the celerity, if not the poetry of motion, upon genuine happiness, rampant and unrestrained, go down to Louisiana and see the slaves dancing in the starlight of a Christmas night. On that particular Christmas I have now in my mind, a description whereof will serve as a description of the day generally, Miss Lively and Mr. Sam, the first belonging to Stewart, the latter to Roberts, started the ball. It was well known that Sam cherished an ardent passion for Lively, as also did one of Marshall's and another of Carey's boys. For Lively was lively indeed, and a heart-breaking coquette withal. It was a victory for Sam Roberts, when, rising from the repast, she gave him her hand for the first "figure," in preference to either of his rivals. They were somewhat crestfallen, and, shaking their heads angrily, rather intimated they would like to pitch into Sam and hurt him badly. But not an emotion of wrath ruffled the placid bosom of Samuel as his legs flew like drumsticks down the outside and up the middle, by the side of his bewitching partner. The whole company cheered them vociferously, and, excited with the applause, they continued, tearing down, after all the others had become exhausted and halted a moment to recover breath. But Sam's superhuman exertions overcame him finally, leaving Lively alone, yet whirling like a top. Thereupon one of Sam's rivals, Pete Marshall, dashed in, and with might and main leaped and shuffled and threw himself into every conceivable shape, as if determined to show Miss Lively and all the world that Sam Roberts was of no account. Pete's affection, however, was greater than his discretion. Such violent exercise took the breath out of him directly, and he dropped like an empty bag. Then was the time for Harry Carey to try his hand, but Lively also soon outwinded him, amidst hurrahs and shouts, fully sustaining her well-earned reputation of being the fastest gal on the bayou. One set off, another takes its place, he or she remaining longest on the floor receiving the most uproarious commendation, and so the dancing continues until broad daylight. It does not cease with the sound of the fiddle, but in that case they set up a music peculiar to themselves. This is called patting, accompanied with one of those unmeaning songs composed rather for its adaptation to a certain tune or measure than for the purpose of expressing any distinct idea. The patting is performed by striking the hands on the knees,
then striking the hands together, then striking the right shoulder with one hand, the left with the other, all the while keeping time with the feet, and singing, perhaps, this song: Harper's Creek and Roaring Ribber, there, my dear, we'll live forever. Den we'll go to the Injin Nation. All I want in dis creation is pretty little wife and big plantation. Chorus: Up dat oak and down dat ribber, 2 overseers and 1 little nigger. Or, if these words are not adapted to the tune called for, it may be that Old Hog Eye is a rather solemn and startling specimen of versification, not, however, to be appreciated unless heard at the South. It runneth as follows: Who's been here since I've been gone? Pretty little gal wid a Josie on. Hog Eye, old Hog Eye, and Hosey too. Never see de like since I was born. Here come a little gal wid a Josie on. Hog Eye, old Hog Eye, and Hosey too. Or maybe the following, perhaps equally nonsensical, but full of melody nevertheless, as it flows from the negro's mouth. Ebo Dick and Jordan's Joe, them 2 niggers stole my yo. Chorus: Hop Jim along, walk Jim along, talk Jim along, etc. Old Black Dan as black as tar, he damn glad he was not dar. Hop Jim along, etc. During the remaining holidays succeeding Christmas, they are provided with passes and permitted to go where they please within a limited distance, or they may remain and labor on the plantation, in which case they are paid for it. It is very rarely, however, that the latter alternative is accepted. They may be seen at these times hurrying in all directions, as happy-looking mortals as can be found on the face of the earth. They are different beings from what they are in the field. The temporary relaxation, the brief deliverance from fear, and from the lash, producing an entire metamorphosis in their appearance and demeanor. In visiting, riding, renewing old friendships, or perchance reviving some old attachment, or pursuing whatever pleasure may suggest itself, the time is occupied. Such is Southern life as it is, 3 days in the year, as I have found it, the other 362 being days of weariness, and fear, and suffering, and unremitting labor. Marriage is frequently contracted during the holidays, if such an institution may be said to exist among them. The only ceremony required before entering into that holy estate is to obtain the consent of the respective owners. Either party can have as many husbands or wives as the owner will permit, and either is at liberty to discard the other at pleasure. The law in relation to divorce and to bigamy and so forth is not applicable to property, of course. If the wife does not belong on the same plantation with the husband, the latter is permitted to visit her on Saturday nights, if the distance is not too far. Uncle Abram's wife lived 7 miles from Epps on Bayou Huff Power. He had permission to visit her once a fortnight, but he was growing old, as has been said, and, truth to say, had latterly well nigh forgotten her. Uncle Abram had no time to spare from his meditations on General Jackson, connubial dalliance being well enough for the young and thoughtless, but unbecoming a grave and solemn philosopher like himself. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of 12 Years a Slave by Solomon Northup. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. With the exception of my trip to St. Mary's Parish and my absence during the cane-cutting seasons, I was constantly employed on the plantation of Master Epps. He was considered but a small planter, not having a sufficient number of hands to require the services of an overseer, acting in the latter capacity himself. Not able to increase his force, it was his custom to hire during the hurry of cotton picking. On larger estates, employing 50 or 100, or perhaps 200 hands, an overseer is deemed indispensable. These gentlemen ride into the field on horseback, without an exception to my knowledge, armed with pistols, bowie knife, whip, and accompanied by several dogs. They follow, equipped in this fashion, in rear of the slaves, keeping a sharp lookout upon them all. The requisite qualifications in an overseer are utter heartlessness, brutality, and cruelty. It is his business to produce large crops, and if that is accomplished, no matter what amount of suffering it may have cost. The presence of the dogs are necessary to overhaul a fugitive who may take to his heels, as is sometimes the case. When faint or sick, he is unable to maintain his row, and unable also to endure the whip. The pistols are reserved for any dangerous emergency, there having been instances where such weapons were necessary. Goaded into uncontrollable madness, even the slave will sometimes turn upon his oppressor. The gallows were standing at Marksville last January, upon which one was executed a year ago for killing his overseer. It occurred not many miles from Epps' plantation on Red River. The slave was given his task at splitting rails. In the course of the day the overseer sent him on an errand, which occupied so much time that it was not possible for him to perform the task. The next day he was called to an account, but the loss of time occasioned by the errand was no excuse, and he was ordered to kneel and bare his back for the reception of the lash. They were in the woods alone, beyond the reach of sight or hearing. The boy submitted until, maddened at such injustice, and insane with pain, he sprang to his feet, and, seizing an axe, literally chopped the overseer in pieces. He made no attempt whatsoever at concealment, but, hastening to his master, related the whole affair, and declared himself ready to expiate the wrong by the sacrifice of his life. He was led to the scaffold, and, while the rope was around his neck, maintained an undismayed and fearless bearing, and with his last words justified the act. Besides the overseer, there are drivers under him, the number being in proportion to the number of hands in the field. The drivers are black, who, in addition to the performance of their equal share of work, are compelled to do the whipping of their several gangs. Whips hang around their necks, and if they fail to use them thoroughly, are whipped themselves. They have a few privileges, however. For example, in cane cutting, the hands are not allowed to sit down long enough to eat their dinners. Carts filled with corn cake, cooked at the kitchen, are driven into the field at noon. The cake is distributed by the drivers, and must be eaten with the least possible delay. When the slave ceases to perspire, as he often does when taxed beyond his strength, he falls to the ground and becomes utterly helpless. It is then the duty of the driver to drag him into the shade of a standing cotton or cane, or of a neighboring tree, where he dashes buckets of water upon him, and uses other means of bringing out perspiration again, when he is ordered to his place and compelled to continue his labor. At Huff Power, when I first came to Epps, Tom, one of Robert's negroes, was driver. He was a burly fellow, and severe in the extreme. After Epps' removal to Bayou Boeuf, that distinguished honor was conferred upon myself. Up to the time of my departure, I had to wear a whip about my neck in the field. If Epps was present, I dared not show any lenity, not having the Christian fortitude of a certain well-known Uncle Tom sufficiently to brave his wrath, by refusing to perform the office. In that way, only, I escaped the immediate martyrdom he suffered, and, withal, saved my companions much suffering, as it proved in the end. Epps, I soon found, whether actually in the field or not, had his eyes pretty generally upon us. From the piazza, from behind some adjacent tree, or other concealed point of observation, he was perpetually on the watch. If one of us had been backward or idle through the day, we were apt to be told all about it on returning to the quarters, and it was a matter of principle with him to reprove every offence of that kind that came within his knowledge. The offender not only was certain of receiving a castigation for his tardiness, but I likewise was punished for permitting it. If, on the other hand, he had seen me use the lash freely, the man was satisfied. Practice makes perfect truly, and during my 8 years' experience as a driver, I learned to handle the whip with marvelous dexterity and precision, throwing the lash within a hair's breadth of the back, the ear, the nose, without, however, touching either of them. If Epps was observed at a distance, or we had reason to apprehend he was sneaking somewhere in the vicinity, I would commence plying the lash vigorously, when, according to arrangement, they would squirm and screech as if in agony, although not one of them had in fact been even grazed. Patsy would take occasion, if he had made his appearance presently, to mumble in his hearing some complaints that Platt was lashing them the whole time, and Uncle Abram, with an appearance of honesty peculiar to himself, would declare roundly I had just whipped them worse than General Jackson whipped the enemy at New Orleans. If Epps was not drunk, and in one of his beastly humours, this was, in general, satisfactory. If he was, some one or more of us must suffer, as a matter of course. Sometimes his violence assumed a dangerous form, placing the lives of his human stock in jeopardy. On one occasion the drunken madman thought to amuse himself by cutting my throat. He had been absent at Holmesville, in attendance at a shooting match, and none of us were aware of his return. While hoeing by the side of Patsy, she exclaimed in a low voice suddenly, "Platt, do you see old Hogjaw beckoning me to come to him?" Glancing sideways, I discovered him in the edge of the field, motioning and grimacing, as was his habit when half intoxicated. Aware of his lewd intentions, Patsy began to cry. I whispered her not to look up, and to continue at her work, as if she had not observed him. Suspecting the truth of the matter, however, he soon staggered up to me in a great rage. "What did you say to Pats?" he demanded with an oath. I made him some evasive answer, which only had the effect of increasing his violence. "How long have you owned this plantation, say, you damned nigger?" he inquired, with a malicious sneer, at the same time taking hold of my shirt collar with one hand and thrusting the other into his pocket. "Now I'll cut your black throat, that's what I'll do," drawing his knife as he said it. But with one hand he was unable to open it, until finally seizing the blade in his teeth, I saw he was about to succeed, and felt the necessity of escaping from him, for in his present reckless state it was evident he was not joking by any means. My shirt was open in front, and as I turned round quickly and sprang from him, while he still retained his grip, it was stripped entirely from my back. There was no difficulty now in eluding him. He would chase me until out of breath, then stop until it was recovered, swear, and renew the chase again. Now he would command me to come to him, now endeavor to coax me, but I was careful to keep at a respectful distance. In this manner we made the circuit of the field several times, he making desperate plunges, and I always dodging them, more amused than frightened, well knowing that when his sober senses returned, he would laugh at his own drunken folly. At length I observed the mistress standing by the yard fence, watching our half-serious, half-comical manoeuvres. Shooting past him, I ran directly to her. Epps, on discovering her, did not follow. He remained about the field an hour or more, during which time I stood by the mistress, having related the particulars of what had taken place. Now, she was aroused again, denouncing her husband and Patsy about equally. Finally, Epps came towards the house, by this time nearly sober, walking demurely with his hands behind his back, and attempting to look as innocent as a child. As he approached, nevertheless, Mistress Epps began to berate him roundly, heaping upon him many rather disrespectful epithets, and demanding for what reason he had attempted to cut my throat. Epps made wondrous strange of it all, and to my surprise swore by all the saints in the calendar he had not spoken to me that day. "Platt, you lying nigger, have I?" was his brazen appeal to me. It is not safe to contradict a master, even by the assertion of a truth, so I was silent, and when he entered the house I returned to the field, and the affair was never after alluded to. Shortly after this time a circumstance occurred that came nigh divulging the secret of my real name and history, which I had so long and carefully concealed, and upon which I was convinced depended my final escape. Soon after he purchased me, Epps asked me if I could write and read, and on being informed that I had received some instruction in those branches of education, he assured me, with emphasis, if he ever caught me with a book, or with pen and ink, he would give me 100 lashes. He said he wanted me to understand that he bought niggers to work and not to educate. He never inquired a word of my past life, or from whence I came. The mistress, however, cross-examined me frequently about Washington, which she supposed was my native city, and more than once remarked that I did not talk nor act like the other niggers, and she was sure I had seen more of the world than I admitted. My great object was always to invent means of getting a letter secretly into the post office, directed to some of my friends or family at the North. The difficulty of such an achievement cannot be comprehended by one unacquainted with the severe restrictions imposed upon me. In the first place, I was deprived of pen, ink, and paper. In the second place, a slave cannot leave his plantation without a pass, nor will a postmaster mail a letter for one without written instructions from his owner. I was in slavery 9 years, and always watchful and on the alert, before I met with the good fortune of obtaining a sheet of paper. While Epps was in New Orleans one winter, disposing of his cotton, the mistress sent me to Holmesville, with an order for several articles, and among the rest, a quantity of foolscap. I appropriated a sheet, concealing it in the cabin, under the board on which I slept. After various experiments, I succeeded in making ink, by boiling white maple bark, and with a feather plucked from the wing of a duck, manufactured a pen. When all were asleep in the cabin, by the light of the coals lying upon my plank couch, I managed to complete a somewhat lengthy epistle. It was directed to an old acquaintance at Sandy Hill, stating my condition and urging him to take measures to restore me to liberty. This letter I kept a long time, contriving measures by which it could be safely deposited in the post office. At length, a low fellow by the name of Armsby, hitherto a stranger, came into the neighborhood, seeking a situation as overseer. He applied to Epps, and was about the plantation for several days. He next went over to Shaw's nearby, and remained with him several weeks. Shaw was generally surrounded by such worthless characters, being himself noted as a gambler and unprincipled man. He had made a wife of his slave Charlotte, and a brood of young mulattoes were growing up in his house. Armsby became so much reduced at last that he was compelled to labor with the slaves. A white man working in a field is a rare and unusual spectacle on Bayou Boeuf. I improved every opportunity of cultivating his acquaintance privately, desiring to obtain his confidence so far as to be willing to entrust the letter to his keeping. He visited Marksville repeatedly, he informed me, a town some 20 miles distant, and there I proposed to myself the letter should be mailed. Carefully deliberating on the most proper manner of approaching him on the subject, I concluded finally to ask him simply if he would deposit a letter for me in the Marksville post office the next time he visited that place, without disclosing to him that the letter was written, or any of the particulars it contained. For I had fears that he might betray me, and knew that some inducement must be held out to him of a pecuniary nature, before it would be safe to confide in him. As late as 1 o'clock one night, I stole noiselessly from my cabin, and, crossing the field to Shaw's, found him sleeping on the piazza. I had but a few picayunes, the proceeds of my fiddling performances, but all I had in the world I promised him if he would do me the favor required. I begged him not to expose me if he could not grant the request. He assured me, upon his honor, he would deposit it in the Marksville post office, and that he would keep it an inviolable secret forever. Though the letter was in my pocket at the time, I dared not then deliver it to him, but stating I would have it written in a day or two, bade him good night, and returned to my cabin. It was impossible for me to expel the suspicions I entertained, and all night I lay awake, revolving in my mind the safest course to pursue. I was willing to risk a great deal to accomplish my purpose, but should the letter by any means fall into the hands of Epps, it would be a death blow to my aspirations. I was perplexed in the extreme. My suspicions were well founded, as the sequel demonstrated. The next day but one, while scraping cotton in the field, Epps seated himself on the line fence between Shaw's plantation and his own, in such a position as to overlook the scene of our labors. Presently Armsby made his appearance, and, mounting the fence, took a seat beside him. They remained 2 or 3 hours, all of which time I was in an agony of apprehension. That night, while broiling my bacon, Epps entered the cabin with his rawhide in his hand. "Well, boy," said he, "I understand I've got a larned nigger that writes letters and tries to get white fellers to mail 'em. Wonder if you know who he is?" My worst fears were realized, and although it may not be considered entirely creditable, even under the circumstances, yet a resort to duplicity and downright falsehood was the only refuge that presented itself. "Don't know nothing about it, Master Epps," I answered him, assuming an air of ignorance and surprise. "Don't know nothing at all about it, sir." "Want you over to Shaw's night before last?" he inquired. "No, master," was the reply. "Haven't you asked that feller, Armsby, to mail a letter for you at Marksville?" "Why, Lord, master, I never spoke 3 words to him in all my life. I don't know what you mean." "Well," he continued, "Armsby told me to-day the devil was among my niggers, that I had one that needed close watching or he would run away, and when I axed him why, he said you come over to Shaw's and waked him up in the night and wanted him to carry a letter to Marksville. What have you got to say to that, huh?" "All I've got to say, master," I replied, "is there is no truth in it. How could I write a letter without any ink or paper? 'Cause I ain't got no friends living as I know of. That Armsby is a lying, drunken feller, they say, and nobody believes him anyway. You know I always tell the truth, and that I never go off the plantation without a pass. Now, master, I can see what that Armsby is after plain enough. Didn't he want you to hire him for an overseer?" "Yes, he wanted me to hire him," answered Epps. "That's it," said I. "He wants to make you believe we're all going to run away, and then he thinks you'll hire an overseer to watch us. He just made that story out of whole cloth, 'cause he wants to get a situation. It's all a lie, master, you may depend on it." Epps mused a while, evidently impressed with the plausibility of my theory, and exclaimed, "I'm damned, Platt, if I don't believe you tell the truth. He must take me for a soft, to think he can come it over me with them kind of yarns, mustn't he? Maybe he thinks he can fool me. Maybe he thinks I don't know nothing. Can't take care of my own niggers, eh? Soft soap old Epps, eh? Damn Armsby. Set the dogs on him, Platt." And with many other comments descriptive of Armsby's general character, and his capability of taking care of his own business, and attending to his own niggers, Master Epps left the cabin. As soon as he was gone, I threw the letter in the fire, and, with a desponding and despairing heart, beheld the epistle which had cost me so much anxiety and thought, and which I fondly hoped would have been my forerunner to the land of freedom, writhe and shrivel on its bed of coals, and dissolve into smoke and ashes. Armsby, the treacherous wretch, was driven from Shaw's plantation not long subsequently, much to my relief, for I feared he might renew his conversation, and perhaps induce Epps to credit him. I knew not now whither to look for deliverance. Hopes sprang up in my heart only to be crushed and blighted. The summer of my life was passing away. I felt I was growing prematurely old, that a few years more, and toil and grief, and the poisonous miasmas of the swamps would accomplish their work upon me, would consign me to the grave's embrace, to moulder and be forgotten. Repelled, betrayed, cut off from the hope of succor, I could only prostrate myself upon the earth and groan in unutterable anguish. The hope of rescue was the only light that cast a ray of comfort on my heart. That was now flickering, faint, and low. Another breath of disappointment would extinguish it altogether, leaving me to grope in midnight darkness to the end of life. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of 12 Years a Slave by Solomon Northup. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The year 1850, down to which I have now arrived, omitting many occurrences uninteresting to the reader, was an unlucky year for my companion Wiley, the husband of Phoebe, whose taciturn and retiring nature has thus far kept him in the background. Notwithstanding Wiley seldom opened his mouth, and revolved in his obscure and unpretending orbit without a grumble, nevertheless the warm elements of sociality were strong in the bosom of that silent nigger. In the exuberance of his self-reliance, disregarding the philosophy of Uncle Abram, and setting the counsels of Aunt Phoebe utterly at naught, he had the foolhardiness to essay a nocturnal visit to a neighbouring cabin without a pass. So attractive was the society in which he found himself, that Wiley took little note of the passing hours, and the light began to break in the east before he was aware. Speeding homeward as fast as he could run, he hoped to reach the quarters before the horn would sound, but unhappily he was spied on the way by a company of patrollers. How it is in the other dark places of slavery, I do not know, but on Bayou Boeuf there is an organization of patrollers, as they are styled, whose business it is to seize and whip any slave they may find wandering from the plantation. They ride on horseback, headed by a captain, armed and accompanied by dogs. They have the right, either by law or by general consent, to inflict discretionary chastisement upon a black man caught beyond the boundaries of his master's estate without a pass, and even to shoot him if he attempts to escape. Each company has a certain distance to ride up and down the bayou. They are compensated by the planters, who contribute in proportion to the number of slaves they own. The clatter of their horses' hoofs dashing by can be heard at all hours of the night, and frequently they may be seen driving a slave before them, or leading him by a rope fastened around his neck to his owner's plantation. Wiley fled before one of these companies, thinking he could reach his cabin before they could overtake him. But one of their dogs, a great ravenous hound, gripped him by the leg and held him fast. The patrollers whipped him severely, and brought him, a prisoner, to Epps. From him he received another flagellation still more severe, so that the cuts of the lash and the bites of the dog rendered him sore, stiff, and miserable, insomuch he was scarcely able to move. It was impossible in such a state to keep up his row, and consequently there was not an hour in the day but Wiley felt the sting of his master's rawhide on his raw and bleeding back. His sufferings became intolerable, and finally he resolved to run away. Without disclosing his intentions to run away, even to his wife Phoebe, he proceeded to make arrangements for carrying his plan into execution. Having cooked his whole week's allowance, he cautiously left the cabin on a Sunday night after the inmates of the quarters were asleep. When the horn sounded in the morning, Wiley did not make his appearance. Search was made for him in the cabins, in the corn crib, in the cotton house, and in every nook and corner of the premises. Each of us was examined, touching any knowledge we might have that could throw light upon his sudden disappearance or present whereabouts. Epps raved and stormed, and mounting his horse, galloped to neighboring plantations, making inquiries in all directions. The search was fruitless. Nothing whatever was elicited, going to show what had become of the missing man. The dogs were led to the swamp, but were unable to strike his trail. They would circle away through the forest, their noses to the ground, but invariably returned in a short time to the spot from whence they started. Wiley had escaped, and so secretly and cautiously as to elude and baffle all pursuit. Days and even weeks passed away, and nothing could be heard of him. Epps did nothing but curse and swear. It was the only topic of conversation among us when alone. We indulged in a great deal of speculation in regard to him, one suggesting he might have drowned in some bayou, inasmuch as he was a poor swimmer. Another, that perhaps he might have been devoured by alligators, or stung by the venomous moccasin, whose bite is certain and sudden death. The warm and hearty sympathies of us all, however, were with poor Wiley, wherever he might be. Many an earnest prayer ascended from the lips of Uncle Abram, beseeching safety for the wanderer. In about 3 weeks, when all hope of ever seeing him again was dismissed, to our surprise, he one day appeared among us. On leaving the plantation, he informed us, it was his intention to make his way back to South Carolina, to the old quarters of Master Buford. During the day he remained secreted, sometimes in the branches of a tree, and at night pressed forward through the swamps. Finally, one morning, just at dawn, he reached the shore of Red River. While standing on the bank, considering how he could cross it, a white man accosted him and demanded a pass. Without one, and evidently a runaway, he was taken to Alexandria, the shire town of the parish of Rapides, and confined in prison. It happened, several days after that, Joseph B. Roberts, uncle of Mistress Epps, was in Alexandria, and going into the jail, recognized him. Wiley had worked on his plantation, when Epps resided at Huff Power. Paying the jail fee and writing him a pass, underneath which was a note to Epps requesting him not to whip him on his return, Wiley was sent back to Bayou Boeuf. It was the hope that hung upon this request, and which Roberts assured him would be respected by his master, that sustained him as he approached the house. The request, however, as may be readily supposed, was entirely disregarded. After being kept in suspense 3 days, Wiley was stripped and compelled to endure one of those inhuman floggings to which the poor slave is so often subjected. It was the first and last attempt of Wiley to run away. The long scars upon his back, which he will carry with him to the grave, perpetually remind him of the dangers of such a step. There was not a day throughout the 10 years I belonged to Epps that I did not consult with myself upon the prospect of escape. I laid many plans, which at the time I considered excellent ones, but one after the other they were all abandoned. No man who has never been placed in such a situation can comprehend the 1,000 obstacles thrown in the way of the flying slave. Every white man's hand is raised against him. The patrollers are watching for him, the hounds are ready to follow on his track, and the nature of the country is such as renders it impossible to pass through it with any safety. I thought, however, that the time might come, perhaps, when I should be running through the swamps again. I concluded, in that case, to be prepared for Epps' dogs, should they pursue me. He possessed several, one of which was a notorious slave hunter, and the most fierce and savage of his breed. While out hunting the coon or the opossum, I never allowed an opportunity to escape, when alone, of whipping them severely. In this manner I succeeded at length in subduing them completely. They feared me, obeying my voice at once when others had no control over them whatever. Had they followed and overtaken me, I doubt not they would have shrank from attacking me. Notwithstanding the certainty of being captured, the woods and swamps are, nevertheless, continually filled with runaways. Many of them, when sick or so worn out as to be unable to perform their tasks, escape into the swamps, willing to suffer the punishment inflicted for such offences, in order to obtain a day or two of rest. When I belonged to Ford, I was unwittingly the means of disclosing the hiding place of 6 or 8, who had taken up their residence in the Great Pine Woods. Adam Tatum frequently sent me from the mills over to the opening after provisions. The whole distance was then a thick pine forest. About 10 o'clock of a beautiful moonlight night, while walking along the Texas road, returning to the mills, carrying a dressed pig in a bag swung over my shoulder, I heard footsteps behind me, and turning round, beheld 2 black men in the dress of slaves, approaching at a rapid pace. When within a short distance, one of them raised a club, as if intending to strike me, the other snatched at the bag. I managed to dodge them both, and seizing a pine knot, hurled it with such force against the head of one of them that he was prostrated apparently senseless to the ground. Just then 2 more made their appearance from one side of the road. Before they could grapple me, however, I succeeded in passing them, and taking to my heels, fled, much affrighted, towards the mills. When Adam was informed of the adventure, he hastened straight away to the Indian village, and arousing Cascalla and several of his tribe, started in pursuit of the highwaymen. I accompanied them to the scene of attack, when we discovered a puddle of blood in the road, where the man whom I had smitten with the pine knot had fallen. After searching carefully through the woods a long time, one of Cascalla's men discovered a smoke curling up through the branches of several prostrate pines, whose tops had fallen together. The rendezvous was cautiously surrounded, and all of them taken prisoners. They had escaped from a plantation in the vicinity of Lamourie, and had been secreted there 3 weeks. They had no evil design upon me, except to frighten me out of my pig. Having observed me passing towards Ford's just at nightfall, and suspecting the nature of my errand, they had followed me, seen me butcher and dress the porker, and start on my return. They had been pinched for food, and were driven to this extremity by necessity. Adam conveyed them to the parish jail, and was liberally rewarded. Not unfrequently the runaway loses his life in the attempt to escape. Epps' premises were bounded on one side by Cary's, a very extensive sugar plantation. He cultivates annually at least 1,500 acres of cane, manufacturing 22 or 2,300 hogsheads of sugar, and hogshead and a half being the usual yield of an acre. Besides this, he also cultivates 500 or 600 acres of corn and cotton. He owned last year 153 field hands, besides nearly as many children, and yearly hires a drove during the busy season from this side the Mississippi. One of his negro drivers, a pleasant, intelligent boy, was named Augustus. During the holidays, and occasionally while at work in adjoining fields, I had an opportunity of making his acquaintance, which eventually ripened into a warm and mutual attachment. Summer before last, he was so unfortunate as to incur the displeasure of the overseer, a coarse, heartless brute, who whipped him most cruelly. Augustus ran away. Reaching a cane rick on Hawkins' plantation, he secreted himself in the top of it. All Carey's dogs were put upon his track, some 15 of them, and soon scented his footsteps to the hiding place. They surrounded the rick, baying and scratching, but could not reach him. Presently, guided by the clamour of the hounds, the pursuers rode up, when the overseer, mounting onto the rick, drew him forth. As he rolled down to the ground, the whole pack plunged upon him, and before they could be beaten off, had gnawed and mutilated his body in the most shocking manner, their teeth having penetrated to the bone in 100 places. He was taken up, tied upon a mule, and carried home. But this was Augustus' last trouble. He lingered until the next day, when death sought the unhappy boy, and kindly relieved him from his agony. It was not unusual for slave women as well as slave men to endeavor to escape. Nellie, Eldret's girl, with whom I lumbered for a time in the Big Cane Brake, lay concealed in Epps' corn crib 3 days. At night, when his family were asleep, she would steal into the quarters for food, and return to the crib again. We concluded it would no longer be safe for us to allow her to remain, and accordingly she retraced her steps to her own cabin. But the most remarkable instance of a successful evasion of dogs and hunters was the following. Among Carey's girls was one by the name of Celeste. She was 19 or 20, and far whiter than her owner or any of his offspring. It required a close inspection to distinguish in her features the slightest trace of African blood. A stranger would never have dreamed that she was the descendant of slaves. I was sitting in my cabin late at night, playing a low air on my violin, when the door opened carefully, and Celeste stood before me. She was pale and haggard. Had an apparition arisen from the earth, I could not have been more startled. "Who are you?" I demanded, after gazing at her a moment. "I'm hungry, give me some bacon," was her reply. My first impression was that she was some deranged young mistress, who, escaping from home, was wandering she knew not whither, and had been attracted to my cabin by the sound of the violin. The coarse cotton slave dress she wore, however, soon dispelled such a supposition. "What is your name?" I again interrogated. "My name is Celeste," she answered. "I belong to Carey, and have been 2 days among the palmettos. I'm sick and can't work, and would rather die in the swamp than be whipped to death by the overseer. Carey's dogs won't follow me. They've tried to set them on. There's a secret between them and Celeste, and they won't mind the devilish orders of the overseer. Give me some meat. I'm starving." I divided my scanty allowance with her, and while partaking of it, she related how she had managed to escape, and described the place of her concealment. In the edge of the swamp, not half a mile from Epps' house, was a large space, thousands of acres in extent, thickly covered with palmetto. Tall trees, whose long arms interlocked each other, formed a canopy above them, so dense as to exclude the beams of the sun. It was like twilight always, even in the middle of the brightest day. In the center of this great space, which nothing but serpents very often explore, a sombre and solitary spot, Celeste had erected a rude hut of dead branches that had fallen to the ground, and covered it with the leaves of the palmetto. This was the abode she had selected. She had no fear of Carey's dogs, any more than I had of Epps. It is a fact, which I have never been able to explain, that there are those whose tracks the hounds will absolutely refuse to follow. Celeste was one of them. For several nights she came to my cabin for food. On one occasion our dogs barked as she approached, which aroused Epps and induced him to reconnoitre the premises. He did not discover her, but after that it was not deemed prudent for her to come to the yard. While all was silent, I carried provisions to a certain spot agreed upon, where she would find them. In this manner Celeste passed the greater part of the summer. She regained her health, and became strong and hearty. At all seasons of the year the howlings of wild animals can be heard at night along the borders of the swamps. Several times they had made her a midnight call, awakening her from slumber with a growl. Terrified by such unpleasant salutations, she finally concluded to abandon her lonely dwelling, and accordingly, returning to her master, was scourged, her neck meanwhile being fastened in the stocks, and sent into the field again. The year before my arrival in the country, there was a concerted movement among a number of slaves on Bayou Boeuf, that terminated tragically indeed. It was, I presume, a matter of newspaper notoriety at the time, but all the knowledge I have of it has been derived from the relation of those living at that period in the immediate vicinity of the excitement. It has become a subject of general and unfailing interest in every slave hut on the bayou, and will doubtless go down to succeeding generations as their chief tradition. Lew Cheney, with whom I became acquainted, a shrewd, cunning negro, more intelligent than the generality of his race, but unscrupulous and full of treachery, conceived the project of organizing a company sufficiently strong to fight their way against all opposition to the neighboring territory of Mexico. A remote spot, far within the depths of the swamp, back of Hawkins' plantation, was selected as the rallying point. Lew flitted from one plantation to another in the dead of night, preaching a crusade to Mexico, and, like Peter the Hermit, creating a furore of excitement wherever he appeared. At length, a large number of runaways were assembled, stolen mules and corn gathered from the fields and bacon filched from smokehouses had been conveyed into the woods. The expedition was about ready to proceed, when their hiding place was discovered. Lew Cheney, becoming convinced of the ultimate failure of his project, in order to curry favor with his master and avoid the consequences which he foresaw would follow, deliberately determined to sacrifice all his companions. Departing secretly from the encampment, he proclaimed among the planters the number collected in the swamp, and instead of stating truly the object they had in view, asserted their intention was to emerge from their seclusion the first favorable opportunity and murder every white person along the bayou. Such an announcement, exaggerated as it passed from mouth to mouth, filled the whole country with terror. The fugitives were surrounded and taken prisoners, carried in chains to Alexandria, and hung by the populace. Not only those, but many who were suspected, though entirely innocent, were taken from the field and from the cabin, and without the shadow of process or form of trial, hurried to the scaffold. The planters on Bayou Boeuf finally rebelled against such reckless destruction of property, but it was not until a regiment of soldiers had arrived from some fort on the Texan frontier, demolished the gallows, and opened the doors of the Alexandria prison, that the indiscriminate slaughter was stayed. Lew Cheney escaped, and was even rewarded for his treachery. He is still living, but his name is despised and execrated by all his race throughout the parishes of Rapides and Avoyelles. Such an idea as insurrection, however, is not new among the enslaved population of Bayou Boeuf. More than once I have joined in serious consultation, when the subject has been discussed, and there have been times when a word from me would have placed hundreds of my fellow bondsmen in an attitude of defiance. Without arms or ammunition, or even with them, I saw such a step would result in certain defeat, disaster, and death, and always raised my voice against it. During the Mexican War, I well remember the extravagant hopes that were excited. The news of victory filled the great house with rejoicing, but produced only sorrow and disappointment in the cabin. In my opinion, and I have had opportunity to know something of the feeling of which I speak, there are not 50 slaves on the shores of Bayou Boeuf, but would hail with unmeasured delight the approach of an invading army. They are deceived who flatter themselves that the ignorant and debased slave has no conception of the magnitude of his wrongs. They are deceived who imagine that he arises from his knees, with back lacerated and bleeding, cherishing only a spirit of meekness and forgiveness. A day may come, it will come if his prayer is heard, a terrible day of vengeance, when the Master in his turn will cry in vain for mercy. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of 12 Years a Slave by Solomon Northup. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Wiley suffered severely at the hands of Master Epps, as has been related in the preceding chapter, but in this respect he fared no worse than his unfortunate companions. Spare the rod was an idea scouted by our master. He was constitutionally subject to periods of ill humor, and at such times, however little provocation there might be, a certain amount of punishment was inflicted. The circumstances attending the last flogging but one that I received will show how trivial a cause was sufficient with him for resorting to the whip. A Mr. O'Neill, residing in the vicinity of the Big Pine Woods, called upon Epps for the purpose of purchasing me. He was a tanner and currier by occupation, transacting an extensive business, and intended to place me at service in some department of his establishment, provided he bought me. Aunt Phoebe, while preparing the dinner table in the great house, overheard their conversation. On returning to the yard at night, the old woman ran to meet me, designing, of course, to overwhelm me with the news. She entered into a minute repetition of all she'd heard, and Aunt Phoebe was one whose ears never failed to drink in every word of conversation uttered in her hearing. She enlarged upon the fact that Massa Epps was gwine to sell me to a tanner over in de Pine Woods, so long and loudly as to attract the attention of the mistress, who, standing unobserved on the piazza at the time, was listening to our conversation. "Well, Aunt Phoebe," said I, "I'm glad of it. I'm tired of scraping cotton, and would rather be a tanner. I hope he'll buy me." O'Neill did not effect a purchase, however, the parties differing as to price, and the morning following his arrival departed homewards. He had been gone but a short time when Epps made his appearance in the field. Now nothing will more violently enrage a master, especially Epps, than the intimation of one of his servants that he would like to leave him. Mistress Epps had repeated to him my expressions to Aunt Phoebe the evening previous, as I learned from the latter afterwards, having mentioned to her that she had overheard us. On entering the field, Epps walked directly to me. "So, Platt, you're tired of scraping cotton, are you? You'd like to change your master, eh? You're fond of moving around? Traveller, ain't you?" "Ah, yes. Like to travel for your health, maybe. Feel above cotton scraping, I suppose. So, you're going into the tanning business. Good business. Devilish fine business. Enterprising nigger. Believe I'll go into that business myself. Down on your knees and strip that rag off your back. I'll try my hand at tanning." I begged earnestly and endeavored to soften him with excuses, but in vain. There was no other alternative. So, kneeling down, I presented my bare back for the application of the lash. "How do you like tanning?" he exclaimed, as the rawhide descended upon my flesh. "How do you like tanning?" he repeated at every blow. In this manner he gave me 20 or 30 lashes, incessantly giving utterance to the word tanning in one form of expression or another. When sufficiently tanned, he allowed me to arise, and with a half malicious laugh assured me, if I still fancied the business, he would give me further instruction in it whenever I desired. This time, he remarked, he had only given me a short lesson in tanning. The next time he would curry me down. Uncle Abram also was frequently treated with great brutality, although he was one of the kindest and most faithful creatures in the world. He was my cabin mate for years. There was a benevolent expression in the old man's face, pleasant to behold. He regarded us with a kind of parental feeling, always counseling us with remarkable gravity and deliberation. Returning from Marshall's plantation one afternoon, whither I had been sent on some errand of the mistress, I found him lying on the cabin floor, his clothes saturated with blood. He informed me that he had been stabbed. While spreading cotton on the scaffold, Epps came home intoxicated from Holmesville. He found fault with everything, giving many orders so directly contrary that it was impossible to execute any of them. Uncle Abram, whose faculties were growing dull, became confused, and committed some blunder of no particular consequence. Epps was so enraged thereat, that with drunken recklessness he flew upon the old man and stabbed him in the back. It was a long, ugly wound, but did not happen to penetrate far enough to result fatally. It was sewed up by the mistress, who censured her husband with extreme severity, not only denouncing his inhumanity, but declaring that she expected nothing else than that he would bring the family to poverty, that he would kill all the slaves on the plantation in some of his drunken fits. It was no uncommon thing with him to prostrate Aunt Phoebe with a chair or stick of wood, but the most cruel whipping that ever I was doomed to witness, one I can never recall with any other emotion than that of horror, was inflicted on the unfortunate Patsy. It has been seen that the jealousy and hatred of Mistress Epps made the daily life of her young and agile slave completely miserable. I am happy in the belief that on numerous occasions I was the means of averting punishment from the inoffensive girl. In Epps' absence the mistress often ordered me to whip her without the remotest provocation. I would refuse, saying that I feared my master's displeasure, and several times ventured to remonstrate with her against the treatment Patsy received. I endeavored to impress her with the truth that the latter was not responsible for the acts of which she complained, but that she, being a slave, and subject entirely to her master's will, he alone was answerable. At length, the green-eyed monster crept into the soul of Epps also, and then it was that he joined with his wrathful wife in an infernal jubilee over the girl's miseries. On a Sabbath day in hoeing time, not long ago, we were on the bayou bank, washing our clothes, as was our usual custom. Presently, Patsy was missing. Epps called aloud, but there was no answer. No one had observed her leaving the yard, and it was a wonder with us whither she had gone. In the course of a couple of hours, she was seen approaching from the direction of Shaw's. This man, as has been intimated, was a notorious profligate, and withal not on the most friendly terms with Epps. Harriet, his black wife, knowing Patsy's troubles, was kind to her, in consequence of which the latter was in the habit of going over to see her every opportunity. Her visits were prompted by friendship merely, but the suspicion gradually entered the brain of Epps that another and a baser passion led her thither, that it was not Harriet she desired to meet, but rather the unblushing libertine, his neighbor. Patsy found her master in a fearful rage on her return. His violence so alarmed her that at first she attempted to evade direct answers to his questions, which only served to increase his suspicions. She finally, however, drew herself up proudly, and in a spirit of indignation boldly denied his charges. "Missus don't give me soap to wash with, as she does the rest," said Patsy, "and you know why. I went over to Harriet's to get a piece," and saying this, she drew it forth from a pocket in her dress, and exhibited it to him. "That's what I went to Shaw's for, Massa Epps," continued she. "The Lord knows that was all." "You lie, you black wench," shouted Epps. "I don't lie, massa. If you kill me, I'll stick to that." "Oh, I'll fetch you down. I'll learn you to go to Shaw's. I'll take the starch out of you," he muttered fiercely through his shut teeth. Then turning to me, he ordered 4 stakes to be driven into the ground, pointing with the toe of his boot to the places where he wanted them. When the stakes were driven down, he ordered her to be stripped of every article of dress. Ropes were then brought, and the naked girl was laid upon her face, her wrists and feet each tied firmly to the stake. Stepping to the piazza, he took down a heavy whip, and placing it in my hands, commanded me to lash her. Unpleasant as it was, I was compelled to obey him. Nowhere that day, on the face of the whole earth, I venture to say, was there such a demoniac exhibition witnessed as then ensued. Mistress Epps stood on the piazza among her children, gazing on the scene with an air of heartless satisfaction. The slaves were huddled together at a little distance, their countenances indicating the sorrow of their hearts. Poor Patsy prayed piteously for mercy, but her prayers were vain. Epps ground his teeth, and stamped upon the ground, screaming at me like a mad fiend to strike harder. "Strike harder, or your turn will come next, you scoundrel," he yelled. "Oh, mercy, massa! Oh, have mercy, do! Oh, God, pity me!" Patsy exclaimed continually, struggling fruitlessly, and the flesh quivering at every stroke. When I had struck her as many as 30 times, I stopped, and turned round toward Epps, hoping he was satisfied, but with bitter oaths and threats, he ordered me to continue. I inflicted 10 or 15 blows more. By this time her back was covered with long welts, intersecting each other like network. Epps was yet furious and savage as ever, demanding if she would like to go to Shaw's again, and swearing he would flog her until she wished she was in hell. Throwing down the whip, I declared I could punish her no more. He ordered me to go on, threatening me with a severer flogging than she had received, in case of refusal. My heart revolted at the inhuman scene, and risking the consequences, I absolutely refused to raise the whip. He then seized it himself, and applied it with 10-fold greater force than I had. The painful cries and shrieks of the tortured Patsy, mingling with the loud and angry curses of Epps, loaded the air. She was terribly lacerated, I may say without exaggeration, literally flayed. The lash was wet with blood, which flowed down her sides and dropped upon the ground. At length she ceased struggling. Her head sank listlessly on the ground. Her screams and supplications gradually decreased and died away into a low moan. She no longer writhed and shrank beneath the lash when it bit out small pieces of her flesh. I thought that she was dying. It was the Sabbath of the Lord. The fields smiled in the warm sunlight. The birds chirped merrily amidst the foliage of the trees. Peace and happiness seemed to reign everywhere, save in the bosoms of Epps and his panting victim and the silent witnesses around him. The tempestuous emotions that were raging there were little in harmony with the calm and quiet beauty of the day. I could look on Epps only with unutterable loathing and abhorrence, and thought within myself, "Thou devil, sooner or later, somewhere in the course of eternal justice, thou shalt answer for this sin." Finally he ceased whipping from mere exhaustion, and ordered Phoebe to bring a bucket of salt and water. After washing her thoroughly with this, I was told to take her to her cabin. Untying the ropes, I raised her in my arms. She was unable to stand, and as her head rested on my shoulder, she repeated many times, in a faint voice scarcely perceptible, "Oh, Platt, oh, Platt," but nothing further. Her dress was replaced, but it clung to her back and was soon stiff with blood. We laid her on some boards in the hut, where she remained a long time, with eyes closed and groaning in agony. At night, Phoebe applied melted tallow to her wounds, and so far as we were able, all endeavored to assist and console her. Day after day she lay in her cabin upon her face, the sores preventing her resting in any other position. A blessed thing it would have been for her, days and weeks and months of misery it would have saved her, had she never lifted up her head in life again. Indeed, from that time forward, she was not what she had been. The burden of a deep melancholy weighed heavily on her spirits. She no longer moved with that buoyant and elastic step. There was not that mirthful sparkle in her eyes that formerly distinguished her. The bounding vigor, the sprightly, laughter-loving spirit of her youth were gone. She fell into a mournful and desponding mood, and oftentimes would start up in her sleep, and with raised hands plead for mercy. She became more silent than she was, toiling all day in our midst, not uttering a word. A careworn, pitiful expression settled on her face, and it was her humor now to weep rather than rejoice. If ever there was a broken heart, one crushed and blighted by the rude grasp of suffering and misfortune, it was Patsy's. She had been reared no better than her master's beast, looked upon merely as a valuable and handsome animal, and consequently possessed but a limited amount of knowledge. And yet a faint light cast its rays over her intellect, so that it was not wholly dark. She had a dim perception of God and of eternity, and a still more dim perception of a Saviour who had died even for such as her. She entertained but confused notions of a future life, not comprehending the distinction between the corporeal and spiritual existence. Happiness, in her mind, was exemption from stripes, from labor, from the cruelty of masters and overseers. Her idea of the joy of heaven was simply rest, and is fully expressed in these lines of a melancholy bard. I ask no paradise on high, with cares on earth oppressed. The only heaven for which I sigh is rest, eternal rest. It is a mistaken opinion that prevails in some quarters, that the slave does not understand the term, does not comprehend the idea of freedom. Even on Bayou Boeuf, where I conceive slavery exists in its most abject and cruel form, where it exhibits features altogether unknown in more northern states, the most ignorant of them generally know full well its meaning. They understand the privilege and exemptions that belong to it, that it would bestow upon them the fruits of their own labors, and that it would secure to them the enjoyment of domestic happiness. They do not fail to observe the difference between their own condition and the meanest white man's, and to realize the injustice of the laws which place it in his power not only to appropriate the profits of their industry, but to subject them to unmerited and unprovoked punishment, without remedy, or the right to resist, or to remonstrate. Patsy's life, especially after her whipping, was one long dream of liberty. Far away, to her fancy an immeasurable distance, she knew there was a land of freedom. 1,000 times she had heard that somewhere in the distant north there were no slaves, no masters, In her imagination it was an enchanted region, the paradise of the earth. To dwell where the black man may work for himself, live in his own cabin, till his own soil, was a blissful dream of Patsy's, a dream, alas, the fulfillment of which she can never realize. The effect of these exhibitions of brutality on the household of the slaveholder is apparent. Epps' oldest son is an intelligent lad of 10 or 12 years of age. It is pitiable sometimes to see him chastising, for instance, the venerable Uncle Abram. He will call the old man to account, and if in his childish judgment it is necessary, sentence him to a certain number of lashes, which he proceeds to inflict with much gravity and deliberation. Mounted on his pony, he often rides into the field with his whip, playing the overseer, greatly to his father's delight. Without discrimination at such times, he applies the rawhide, urging the slaves forward with shouts and occasional expressions of profanity, while the old man laughs and commends him as a thorough-going boy. The child is father to the man, and with such training, whatever may be his natural disposition, it cannot well be otherwise than that, on arriving at maturity, the sufferings and miseries of the slave will be looked upon with entire indifference. The influence of the iniquitous system necessarily fosters an unfeeling and cruel spirit, even in the bosoms of those who, among their equals, are regarded as humane and generous. Young Master Epps possessed some noble qualities, yet no process of reasoning could lead him to comprehend that in the eye of the Almighty there is no distinction of color. He looked upon the black man simply as an animal, differing in no respect from any other animal, and the possession of somewhat higher instincts, and, therefore, the more valuable. To work like his father's mules, to be whipped and kicked and scourged through life, to address the white man with hat in hand, and eyes bent servilely on the earth, in his mind was the natural and proper destiny of the slave. Brought up with such ideas, in the notion that we stand without the pale of humanity, no wonder the oppressors of my people are a pitiless and unrelenting race. End of chapter 18.